Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I am Andrew Gennardis, Senator from the 26th District, Chairman of the New York State Senate Committee on Budget and Revenue. Welcome to our roundtable on data financing and the public good, redistribution of the dividends of the consumer data economy. This is an issue that is I've gotten very interested in recent years, and I know a number of my colleagues have, and we really want to do a deep dive in a bunch of discussion points to figure out, understand this economy, this growing sector of our economy, figure out how we can regulate it properly, as well as looking about how we can extract some value for the public good out of the enormous wealth that is created by this sector of the economy. We're going to go around the room and do a round of introductions. I'll start with my colleagues first, but I just want to be very clear at the outset, this conversation today, tech, data, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of areas to touch on when it comes to tech and data and this sector of the economy. We're not here to talk about privacy. We're not here to talk about other issues related to tech. You could have dozens and dozens of roundtables and hearings on those issues alone. While I'm sure there'll be ancillary, to our topic at hand, we really want to focus on understanding data financing, data mining, the value and the role that data plays in this new economy, and what, if anything, we can do about it. So with that, first I want to introduce my colleague who helped sponsor today's roundtable with me, the chairwoman of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Liz Krueger.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Both in the room here with us, and I know we're trying to get the Zoom system to work correctly, so I see one or two people already there. I'm very happy to be co-sponsoring this with my colleague and friend, Senator Gennardis, and I think while we have some different bills, we have exactly the same goals, and we've just approached how we get to those goals slightly differently. And so the idea of having a roundtable discussion with experts in the field is incredibly valuable and helpful. Not all of you, I think, represent groups who want to see any taxation of your activity, but as Senator Gennardis already said, our jobs as elected officials is to make sure there's the correct kinds of regulations out there to ensure protections for consumers and rights of consumers, but also to ensure that the state of New York has adequate revenue to provide the public services that we all need to have. And the truth is, the world is so rapidly moving to a model where such a huge percentage of our economy is driven by what happens on the internet and through internet-based companies, that it is important for governments to understand this changing world, which no longer has state borders, no longer has bricks and mortar stores and workers, and yet a huge percentage of all economic activity is flowing through Wi-Fi systems and clouds. And I'm pretending I even understand what that is. I know how to get on every day, but I don't understand what it means. So I really appreciate everyone's participation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Krueger. I also want to introduce our other colleague from the great borough of Brooklyn, Senator Jabari Brisport.
Good morning, everyone. No words prepared. Just happy to be here. Thank you for these bills. I support the intent.
All right, great. Also, unfortunately, unable to join us today, but another host of today's roundtable is the Deputy Majority Leader of the State Senate, Senator Michael Gianaris, who also has a bill that'll be under discussion today. Unfortunately, he could not be here, and his staff had a last-minute health issue, so they're unable to attend, but they wanted us to send their regards and regrets for not being able to join us. So I think before we dive in, it'll be helpful if we just do a quick round of introductions. We can start with Jonathan just quickly around the room, and then we'll go on to the screen as well. Just tell us your name, your organization, and who you represent, and then we will jump right into our topics.
Jonathan Askin, I'm a professor at Brooklyn Law School. I am a current constituent and huge fan of Senator Gennardis. Last year I was lived in the same place, worked in the same place. I was a constituent of Senator Brisport. Love them both and love Senator Krueger as well, so anything I can do to help on the data tax front.
Hello everyone, my name is Joe Toscano. I'm an ex-Google consultant who really decided to speak out against waste on industry. I'm a published author, wrote a book called Automating Humanity to help educate the public about how this can be made better. And it was also featured in The Social Dilemma, big Netflix film if you haven't seen it. It's a documentary. And I've had a lot of work in helping people explain these topics in a more simple way. I think that this industry operates a lot like a black market. A tax is something that can bring this into something that's more legitimized, allow us to have a conversation about value, and make this more equitable for the communities that this is impacting.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amani Thompson. I'm here with Data Create as well. So my background, I've done a lot of work through privacy analysis and also in lobbying for data privacy, biometric surveillance rights.
It's me again, Senator Briscoe. Hi.
Oh, I'm Becky. Hi, I am the policy director for Senator Andrew Gennardis. I work for him. I also helped draft our data tax bill, one of the proposals we'll be talking about today, S6727. Worked with many of you in this room on it. Very excited to be here.
Hi, my name's Paul Romer. I'm old, so even older than you, I think. So I'm going to wear a mask. I barely know who the others are. So I'm here in two capacities. One is an economist, where I can make statements of the form that the consensus amongst economists about taxes is, but also just as a citizen who has a view about what's the right kind of policy approach towards this kind of data collection. And I'll try and be clear about which hat I'm wearing when I comment.
I'm Rob Plattner. I currently work for Senate Finance, spend a lot of my time with Senator Kruger and put a lot of work into our version of a data tax bill. My immediate prior employment was as the Deputy Commissioner for Policy at the State Tax Department, where I worked for 11 years.
I'm Michael Horn. I'm the current head of data product for TBWA Worldwide. So for those of you who are familiar with the holding company agency structure, I'm right at the heart of it. But I've actually, in my career, been doing data in the digital media space for about 25 years. And I've worked in 3 different capacities on the publisher side, hosting content. On the agency and brand side, so helping large marketing companies, large brands figure out who their customers are and how to speak to them. And also as the chief analytics officer of a MarTech firm called Resonate, which worked very closely with the third-party data ecosystem, and brokers, which are very much the topic of today. So excited to be kind of the phone a friend for those who have not worked hands-on in the data space.
I'm one of those semi-masked people who's always trying to gauge, should I mask? Do I not mask? When? But I'll take it off so you can hear me. My name is Diane Kennedy. I'm the president of the New York News Publishers Association. We used to be the Newspaper Publishers Association until our members began to go digital around 2010. Our members range in size from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, to the smallest online-only news organizations and everything in between. We still very much have a foot in both worlds, print and digital. I am not a very techie person, so I can't answer anything terribly complicated about ad tech, but I can certainly talk about how newspapers generate revenue and how that's changing, and how we spend money, which we're really good at.
Great, thank you. We'll turn to our friends remotely. We'll start with Colin.
Thank you. My name is Colin Walke. I'm a cybersecurity and data privacy attorney in Oklahoma City, and I've also been in the House of Representatives here in Oklahoma for 6 years and ran opt-in data privacy legislation. And I am just joining in predominantly to learn and listen, so I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. All right, and Michael.
Good morning, I'm Michael Mazeroff. I'm a senior fellow with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C. I primarily work on state corporate and sales tax policy. I've done a lot of work over the years on electronic commerce. I've probably written more words against the Internet Tax Freedom Act than any other person in the United States, and rather unsuccessfully. So you can decide based on that how credible anything I might say today is. But I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this roundtable. And I will also say I've been a long time colleague of Rob Plattner, going back decades. I've done a lot of work with Rob, and Rob and I actually stood outside in the cold the Supreme Court outside the Supreme Court the morning that the Wayfair decision was being considered. Rob got into the courtroom as an attorney. I was kept out.
Great, well, thanks for being here. And I know we have a representative from Senator Hoylman's office is here as well.
Hi, I'm Caroline Wexelberg, I'm Senator Hoylman's Budget Director.
Great, and we have some other staff in the room as well.
Hi, PJ Machine, I'm from Senator Thomas's office.
Senator Thomas, yeah. Great.
Hi, good morning. I'm Kim Van for Senator Mayer.
Hi, Joel Krinsky. I'm a student of Professor Jonathan Askins.
And I am Joseph Powers. I am likewise a student of Professor Askins.
Great.
Hi, Gabriel Panisa. I'm with Senate Program Council.
We're also joined by Tori Kelly, my chief of staff, and Tyler Adams, my communications director, and Jane Duong, my district director as well. We got everyone, right? Did I miss anyone? We got everybody. Okay. So thank you, everyone. Welcome. We did have, we wanted to make sure that this conversation is really a homework exercise. We really want to kind of dive into these topics earnestly and honestly. We wanted to make sure that we had a conversation in a room that was balanced and reflective of all the views, or as many views as possible, and stakeholders in this conversation. We did invite Tech NYC, which is the umbrella group for the tech industry here in New York, as well as TechNet, to speak and to participate. They both had confirmed, but for various reasons, had to withdraw and were not able to join us today. But because we are recording this roundtable and it will be public later on, we just want to make sure that the record reflects that those views were also invited to participate, so it doesn't look like it's a one-sided conversation by any means. Before we dive in, I thought it'd be helpful if we start. We're here to discuss 3 bills in particular as the jumping off point for a lot of this discussion. I have a data tax bill, Senator Krueger has a data tax bill, and then Senator Janaris has a digital advertising tax bill. And we thought it'd be helpful to just do a very quick overview of each of those very briefly. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Becky.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I am going to run through the 3 bills quickly. I do want to make a note on the agenda that you guys have before you. Even though I'm talking about the bills, after this we're going to do a deep dive into the industry. We're going to talk about industry practices and the data economy. We structured it this way because we feel that an understanding of the industry is really foundational to figuring out how exactly to tax the data economy, and that will be the focus of the latter half of the day, which is the afternoon discussion. So first up we have, and if you miss anything I say, there's also a description of the bills in the background memo that we've prepared for you. First we have S6727 Gennardis. This is a tax on all data controllers and processors that are profiting off of New Yorkers. A data controller, for those of you who don't know, is defined as anybody who controls the means and processing of personal consumer data. This is sort of the accepted legal language for data actors that we actually borrowed from the European Union. It's kind of anybody who has consumer data on their server. A processor is somebody who takes that data and performs some kind of operations on it, like a set of analytics for the data controller. The way that we have the audience that we are capturing in our bill is anybody who's a data controller or data processor that is using data in a way that is profitable, that is extracting consumer data from New Yorkers for profit. So it levies, this bill levies a 2% tax on annual gross revenues of those companies, so all revenues from all foreign and domestic sources, times the percentage of total consumers that are New Yorkers. So it might be a $5 million tax, 20% of my consumers are New Yorkers, it's 5 million times 20%. We exempt anybody who is using data in a way that is sort of incidental to their business model. who is not really profiting off of it. We also exempt anybody that makes below $5 million in annual gross revenues or who is a startup within the last 3 years. All data controllers and processors are going to be required to register with a newly created Office of Consumer Data Protection. They're going to have to report how much data they're collecting and how much money they make. Very large component of the bill. And we also create civil fines for failure to register or if you give incomplete information upon registration. So that's the first bill. Second bill is S4959 by Senator Krueger. This bill is a little bit similar to ours in terms of the audience that it's capturing. It's a graduated excise tax on any for-profit entity that collects, maintains, uses, processes, sells, or shares consumer data in support of its business activities. It applies only to entities that collect data from more than 1 million New Yorkers. It applies a graduated rate that ranges from 5 cents per consumer, per New York consumer per month, to 2.5 million plus 50 cents per consumer per month over the 10 millionth consumer, depending on how many New Yorkers you are harvesting data from. And so different from the Gennardis bill because it's not based on revenues, it's based on number of people is the tax rate. It creates a rebuttable presumption that an in-state home address, mailing address, or IP address linked to an in-state location, that's a New York consumer. This tax would be administered by Department of Taxation and Finance. I didn't see any specific new penalties mentioned in the bill. Of course, there are plenty of existing penalties, such as civil fines in tax law for failure to pay, so those penalties would likely apply for noncompliance. Lastly, we have S1124 Generis. This bill is based heavily on the Maryland data tax, which we're going to talk about a lot today. Very, very heavily influenced by it. This is a digital advertising tax, so it's different than the other two because you're just taxing digital ads sort of at the end of that data economy transaction chain. It's levied on any entity that makes more than 100 million in total global revenue from all sources, and they also have to cross the threshold of making 1 million from digital advertising in New York. So both thresholds must be crossed. It applies only to what Senator Generis calls an accessible base of New York specific digital ad revenue, but the tax rate is based on global revenues from all sources. Very important detail that will come up later as well. The tax rate scales based on revenue from 2.5% for 100 million in total global revenue up to 10% if you have revenue that exceeds 15 billion. This bill does put the onus on the entity to know if they can reasonably expect their revenues to sort of exceed those thresholds and have to file a return with, again, the Department of Taxation and Finance. The entity also has to retain records of all the digital advertising that they've done in New York and how much money they've made from it. And it does create a new misdemeanor in the event of noncompliance.
Okay, hope everyone remembered all those details. There will be a quiz after lunch on the tax rates proposed. Thank you very much, Becky. So now we're going to start, as Becky said, kind of doing a little bit of a deep dive into the industry itself. We have a couple of discussion questions here. I think for the purposes of our conversation, we're a pretty small knit room. Feel free to chime in or raise your hand or catch my eye. For the folks participating digitally, just use your raise hand function. We'll make sure we call you as well. And don't be bashful as we go down this road. So first, I think it would be really helpful for us to understand, what role do host platforms play, the Facebooks, the Googles of the world, in profiling consumers and in profiling people who act as consumers who use these services. If anyone wants to chime in there.
Well, I think that the biggest thing is these are some of the biggest social events that we have on the face of the earth, right? Like, I think that one of the scariest things Facebook ever did to me was adding a reaction button, because they became the first to actually start to get information into our emotions, into the way that we actually think about things beyond just like a like button. A like button's just an arbitrary, it's an impact of like, what did I like that moment? But the emotions actually get into the sentiment of the human behind it. And this is really sensitive stuff. That's just one little piece of Facebook, right? This is one of the biggest platforms on the planet. Twitter, similar. Instagram, similar. Play a huge role in the profiling of our society. They have a lot of high-risk information.
So are you saying, is it the adoption of more than just the like functions, like the dislike, the angry face, the happy face, the sad face? Has that been the catalyst, or is it just the existence of the like button itself enough to create the profiling of consumers or of users, who are using these services?
I think that that's just one example, right? There could probably be a dossier of different activities on the platform that become risky behavior. I think it would require a room full of people just to make a list of a little bit of what Facebook probably is doing in its profiling. But I guess what I'm getting at is they've run experiments. They've shown that they can manipulate society. They have a huge impact. They can get into the thoughts of us better, thoughts of our own people better than we can ourselves, right? They know us better than we know ourselves. In terms of what role, they also, they make money off research. They make money off of advertising. They make money off of probably they also make a lot of reinforced stability in the platform because they have extra data, right? They can perform better than a lot of other smaller platforms. They get more revenue, and it allows them to grow their teams faster and create a moat that's almost inescapable.
If I could just add one other thing, I think people who know the industry better could correct me, but my impression is that most of the value that is captured by people in the information processing chain comes ultimately from the sales of advertisements that are targeted to individuals. But then if you look at just the revenue in the United States for Google and Facebook, it's important to remember they are overwhelmingly dominant in this market. For the estimates I had were for 2021 on the order of $60 billion per firm, whereas the next one after those two was Amazon, which was at about 20 billion per year. Microsoft at about like 5 billion per year. So one unfortunate reality is that any tax that really targets indirectly or directly the advertising revenue amounts pretty much to a tax on Google and Facebook, especially if you have an exemption. And they could argue that this is a kind of a discriminatory tax. I think the response is to say that if they've monopolized or created a duopoly that controls this market, they shouldn't complain if a tax on this market hits them predominantly. But they are the overwhelming forces in this market, and ultimately, any tax will ultimately come out of their profits.
But just before we go on, we've been joined by Senator Brett Wellman. Welcome, Brett.
Thank you. So from the point of view of a marketer, so you're a brand, you want to reach your customers, what's unique about Facebook and Google and large platforms is that you don't need anything else, right? You don't need to have your own customer database. You don't have to have a relationship with your customers. These platforms are so powerful in their knowledge of the American consumer landscape or the global consumer landscape that they literally stand alone. And this is quite different from in the case of an individual publisher or an ad network or a data processor that doesn't have a complete ecosystem of their own, in the fact that they can spin up from day one. If you bring a check for $10 million, you don't need anything else besides what they have under their roofs. And that's quite distinct versus the fragmentation of the broader ad tech and MarTech ecosystem.
I just want to respond to that because I think it's all pretty obvious to most of us in this room that the social media platforms are, first of all, getting a social graph of all of us that no one's ever seen in the history of humanity, and they're exploiting behavioral inclinations to drive us towards extreme points of view and giving us misinformation. But I think there are people that are getting a pass in this situation. That's the folks in the programmatic advertising world. No one even knows what programmatic advertising is. But that's the world where you're not even on a social network. At least when you're on a social network, you kind of know that Facebook or Google or Instagram is getting your information because you're deriving value from it. In the world of programmatic advertising, you are deriving zero value from their access to you. They're just bombarding you with ads. When you go on a website and you have a slow clicks, you can't download information because there's 1,000 ads that are being bombarded at you. That was unbeknownst to you, unfair to you. They are gathering information on you and destroying your internet experience. Those are the people that should be getting taxed, are those people that are actually hampering. I mean, we've got to rope them in. I don't think it's just the social networking folks, because at least you've brought into the relationship with Facebook and Instagram.
Could I ask, my impression just on the revenue numbers is that Google and Facebook have to be dominant in what you're calling programmatic advertising.
Not Facebook. Facebook doesn't do that, but Google, yes. Google through DoubleClick has created an ecosystem where, in fact, and they control, they have the preponderance of the information that they are sharing as they deem fit and manipulating as they see fit with the brands and with the advertisers that use Google/DoubleClick to access users. So I think there is a problematic relationship between the brands are getting screwed and users are getting screwed in the relationship between the supply side, demand side, DoubleClick, Google, and their ability to reach and exploit publishers, content publishers. That's where the problem is.
But just to clarify what you mean, Jonathan, when you're saying the programmatic advertising, you mean like web banners, like you're on the website and the sidebars and the web banner. Okay, just
everything, everything that is
or the pop up or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Liz.
It's okay. I was saying I have an article here from Vox saying actually Amazon's number 3 after Google and Facebook, and their numbers skyrocketed from the year you referenced, Professor, in that in 21, since their revenue had gone up 58%. It's now 31 billion in revenue from this model.
Yep.
And I'm just curious, because Rob, when we worked on our bill, we talked about, that probably 25 companies would probably pay 90% of the annual amount, but we certainly found that it would be far more than just Google and Facebook, Amazon, the big media companies, Verizon, Time Warner, Comcast, Viacom, CBS, Disney, Condé Nast. Sorry, newspapers, the New York Times, Diane, I'm not sure if any of your other members did.
Yeah, if I could explain, the industry uses a number, a statistic that's important for what they're going to get for their advertising. There are two names for it. It's either unique monthly visitor or I think average monthly user, and so those numbers are out there and gettable. And it might say that not New York specific, but let's say federally. Google has 270 million unique monthly visitors. That means, they're not counting every time they click. It's just that they go on enough to be counted that way. And so the numbers go down from there, but still, our bill has a minimum of 1 million customers a month. And there are a bunch of companies that are going to get past that mark. And I don't think the numbers on monthly users was as dramatic as the number on revenue. So after the biggest monthly users, it wasn't like it dropped off dramatically. And there are other monthly users like they're not, but in terms of collecting data, there are companies like credit card companies that actually have a tremendous number of people who own a credit card, and they might be a big target in a sense of being getting data from 10 or 12 million New Yorkers because it's so rampant.
And going back to, I'm sorry, just what Jonathan was saying, once they have your data, they're reselling it over and over again to lots of different.
They're repackaging and reselling it over and over unbeknownst to you. But that is seriously way beyond what we're talking about in the social media context or going to a standalone website. You've chosen to do that. You're kind of, we don't really know, but we sort of know at least that we've entered into at least a momentary relationship with Facebook, with Instagram, with Google when we do a search. But when we bring in these other intermediaries that are packaging your data and then selling it to brands and bombarding you, they get money based on the amount of clicks that they get. So when you go to a BuzzFeed site or something, you see all those things, those stories at the bottom. They've got to throw all of those at you. They've got to just flood and contaminate your page so that they can get micropayments from all of the brands that are bidding on access to the user. So it's a charade. They are perpetrating a charade that is even worse, I think, than what we're seeing in social media. I should have a relationship.
So I'm not even coding Thanksgiving, but I looked up a Thanksgiving recipe the other day. So now I counted yesterday, so that was 2 days ago. I got 35 different solicitations, either to sell me food products so I don't have to cook myself for Thanksgiving, or new recipe ideas, or other ingredients I would want for my Thanksgiving dinner. And I was like, all I did was look up a recipe and I'm not even cooking.
Yeah, it's pollution. We should have a tax on that pollution.
But in terms of this issue of concentration, it also interacts with the idea of kind of progressivity that comes in with some kind of zero tax exemption bracket. So in my conversations with the Maryland people, I was emphasizing thinking about a scale where, say, there's $5 billion in revenue per year in advertising revenue. Firms below that, in total U.S. revenue, less than $5 billion a year wouldn't be taxed. If you do that, the only firms that would pay any tax are Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. So it's important to recognize that all of this activity ultimately flows through revenue to a very small subset of firms. And you're correct, Amazon has been increasing very rapidly in terms of the presence in advertising.
Can we get Joe in here a second?
So something I'd also like to consider just as talking points and as we're thinking through this is revenue is important scale that we can immediately see, especially with a public company. But I think there's also something to talk about in terms of taxing based on volume of data, either controlled or processed. We don't really know much about how much these companies are actually aggregating. I think there's an opportunity here to require disclosures that would add transparency to the industry, but also take us a step forward into actually taxing something that is one-to-one in regards to value. We're really getting at the right, because there's also companies like Instagram that got acquired for over $1 billion at the time. They had like 15 employees, they had not much money if any, and they were millions and millions of users, right? Like you can have an impact at a very small scale of technology here, and I think actually like something the GDPR did, there was a derogation for 250 employees or less. Like I just said, we had a couple companies, Instagram, WhatsApp, even Netflix was very small for quite some time, had a lot of impact, had a lot of data. I think there can be more interesting ways to understand and tax parts of this company that we should talk about something.
And to just jump on that point, I think a subsidiary benefit that could be very substantial from any tax measure is that it forces into public view a lot more data and information. So I think anything that basically forces these firms to provide public data would be a real plus.
Yeah, I mean, we just don't even know what to think about with these companies sometimes. We just don't even know where to start.
And I think, to Jonathan's earlier point about almost a distinction between the social media and other companies, I wonder from a layperson's perspective, it actually makes a difference to the user, right? Like, I have a Facebook profile, and on my Facebook profile, I write that I like, Led Zeppelin, The Color Blue, and Greek food, and all of a sudden that becomes the basis by which not only do I get Facebook ads, but then outside of the Facebook environment, I'm getting ads about, Led Zeppelin and The Color Blue and Greek restaurant recipes or whatever, right? So and as a user, let's be honest, no one actually reads through all that, the gobbledygook of the user agreement, right? Which is often billed as a privacy agreement, but it's really about a user, it's like a data usage agreement almost. No one knows the extent that because they posted a picture of themselves at this restaurant, that's going to become a data point, even outside of that environment. So
it's even a little worse than you suggested, because I've never been on Facebook in my life, but Facebook tracks me, and they know what I say about my likes on other sites. So Facebook can do that and then pollute, the experience in someplace else. So it isn't just people who put things on Facebook. We put something anywhere, it's a good chance that Facebook knows about it.
I think that it's really helpful putting definitions against these things. I think on the broader programmatic space, it's helpful to think about the root cause for why these tools exist, right? So if you're a publisher and you're trying to monetize content, especially if you're an independent publisher who maybe represents a niche audience or a niche area of content, and you're looking for ways to monetize, it's technically very, very difficult to on your own monetize that content. So there's an interesting kind of freedom of speech and audience development aspect here. Well, how do you monetize that? Is it via tip jars, donations, like other voluntary means, versus via advertising, where the role that the third parties play is kind of providing that automation of access. Now, granted, it can go absolutely insane and create horrible user experiences, but the root cause is that difficulty of monetizing content.
But subscriptions are the other revenue mechanism that you didn't mention. So it's
Absolutely.
not the case that the only way to support content is advertising revenue.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You could actually go back to the way the market usually works, where you pay something to get something. And subscriptions do precisely that.
That's my cue. Traditionally, when print newspapers were on paper delivered to your house, advertising made up 85% of a newspaper's revenue. Subscriptions made up 10%, 15%. I was thinking this morning, I had a wonderful conversation with the late Assemblyman Richard Brodsky, who had a bill back in about 2009, which I believe Senator Krueger, you were the Senate sponsor, on online advertising. And I missed Senator Brodsky, Assemblyman Brodsky. Anyway, I was talking to him and he said, I don't want to see ads when I'm reading the newspaper. So I found out how much his New York Times subscription was going to cost. And he decided the ads were not so bad after all. That's the thing, is the advertising underwrites the staff salaries, the journalists, the editors, the accountants, all the people that work at a news organization. When you still have a print newspaper, you're also paying press room staff, you're paying marketing. But we still have a foot in each world because we have readers who want to read us in these different formats. So I'd like to just tell you a little bit about what's happened to the newspaper industry over the past 15 years. Every day, 2 newspapers close in this country. Since about 2004, 2,000 newspapers have closed, mostly weekly and rural newspapers, some dailies. New York has been luckier than most. We've lost about 5 daily newspapers. We've lost more than 200 weekly newspapers in the past 15 years. Professional journalists, newsroom staff have been cut by more than half. The decline of revenue was accelerating. There was about a 71% decline in advertising revenue between 2002 and 2012. That's gone off a cliff since then. You can't make it up through subscriptions. What happens if you have to rely entirely on subscription revenue is newspapers become boutique products that are only available to the very wealthy. And then you leave communities without coverage. There's a great deal of research showing that when a newspaper closes in a local community, people stop running for local office. They don't run for the school board. The cost of government borrowing goes up because there's nobody minding the store. Hyperpartisanship increases. We have only one case study that I know of. There was a newspaper in Ogdensburg, up in the North Country, that had to close a few years ago because the revenue just wasn't there. Small businesses have declined. Well, last year they were able to reopen the newspaper. But in the time that the newspaper was closed, the city government really didn't function very well. It became hyper-partisan. There was a lot of infighting until a reporter for the Johnson newspapers, 6th-generation family-owned newspaper company, started coming to the council meetings and watching what was going on and telling the residents what was going on. The wonderful thing about what's happening in the news industry now, there is something good, is that there are a lot of smaller online-only newspapers, especially here in New York City. The Center for Community Media at NYU helps those newspapers with a lot of logistical assistance, but there are news organizations that are covering communities of interest, the LGBTQ community, the Black community, smaller neighborhoods. They don't have printing presses generally, so they're very reliant on digital advertising. So digital advertising is very much a mixed bag for us. I mean, from a revenue perspective, if you can figure out how to turn the clock back to 1985, we'd be so happy. Things were so much better. We do sell digital advertising, directly from the newspaper to the local businesses. It's hard to compete though. Digital advertising is much cheaper than print advertising ever was. Print advertising was hard to target. You could target by neighborhood, you could target by zip code, you could target a little bit by census data. Digital advertising obviously is easier to target very sort of microscopically. But again, it's revenue, and so it would be very harmful to the newspaper industry, especially those smaller newspapers, if the state were to make it more expensive or more difficult to place digital advertising. And it would also impose costs on those advertisers.
And before turn this to before that, we've also been joined by Daquan from Senator Comrie's office. Thank you for Senator Comrie's office for being here. Senator Hoyland?
No, I just wanted to echo some of Diane's concerns, given that we as elected officials have not just seen newspapers close, but the consolidation of newspapers has been really alarming and I think is occurring at a rapid pace. The consolidation of local newspapers all under one brand, which are cookie cutter presented in our districts, where 10 years ago when I first ran for office, they each had a unique individual perspective, editorial independence, their own beats, and now, I feel like my local paper is the New York Times, and that's a very difficult newspaper through which to try to reach constituents because their metro coverage has diminished to practically, a fraction of what they had in previous years.
Yeah, they're a national news organization.
And it's the same issue that you mentioned in Albany. As newspapers consolidate, the presence of journalists in Albany has diminished accordingly. And so not many, reporters, far fewer reporters are on the beat in Albany. The legislative correspondence, offices are like a ghost town at various times. So in addition to looking at this issue, which I think is an important one to raise revenue because we are facing this fiscal cliff, I think in many respects, we do need to figure out ways, and I've worked with you on trying to figure out ways to support local journalism. So I want to just acknowledge that tension that's here that you point out and say that I hope there's a way we can accomplish both.
Well, I just want to point out, and I appreciate Diane's point, if you look at Senator Gennardis' bill and my bill, it's not targeting advertising. Neither of our bills targets advertising revenue. Mike Generis' bill does. That'll also reference, we have a Maryland court who's actually already decided we probably can't go down that road, so.
I disagree,
Sorry.
but
With
we
the
can
court?
go to the DPI.
Okay, fine.
But
We're gonna get to the Maryland case.
Get to the Maryland case.
We can get around that.
But again, if the bigger proposals that the two of us have put in wouldn't be targeting your advertising revenue, but in fact, and I don't know the answer, because again, in our analysis, the only one who would probably fall under our bill is the New York Times. It would be, so what is the New York Times making as money by buying and selling our data? So not what kind of advertising revenue do you have, but rather what kind of buying and selling of people's private data is generating revenue.
But that's not new. That's not new at all. I mean, newspapers always used the fact that they had subscribers in certain areas to sell advertising.
Well, I think and this kind of transitions to our next discussion point, if we can, is the role that data brokers play. And I think while trying to have a consumer profile may not be new, the level of detail that is now involved, which I think is kind of indisputable at this point. The mere fact that people have an online presence, or just a presence period, and all of this data is being scraped all over the place from whatever sources, and is now being packaged and sold so you can advertise right to the specific person you're looking for based on their IP address, right? And you know that they that they bought a Chevy truck last year, so you're going to sell them, ads about SUVs, and you're going to do it at certain hours of the day because you know that that's the time that they're on their particular websites. That's a whole other ballgame of data profiling and data mining that exists, and it's a huge part of this whole economy. I think, one of the estimates that we found in our research was the data economy accounts for nearly 7% of a jurisdiction's GDP, which in the state of New York we have a GDP of roughly $2.3 trillion. We're talking about 200 to 230 billion dollars of economic value based solely on the harvesting of this data in a much more intrusive and deeper way. And I say intrusive because even though it doesn't feel violative, if someone knew, I think if the layperson knew the extent to which public information is out there about them and is being used to then sell them stuff or being used to sell things about them, I think they would be very concerned. I know the more I dive into this, the more I'm concerned. But I really want to think about where do the data brokers, what role do they play in all of this conversation and in this chain? And just a reminder to our folks who are dialing in, feel free to chime in at any time. If you have a question or a comment, we want to make sure that we're hearing from you guys as well.
I think there's a lot of agreement about the importance of trying to preserve local newspapers. So if anybody disagrees on that point, they should speak up. Because I think we all agree.
See me after the meeting.
Depends on the coverage.
It always does.
So then the question is how might one move in this area without at least increasing the harm? The first thing I'd point out is that this whole ecosystem, what's killing the newspapers is Google and Facebook and these online giants who are benefiting disproportionately from online advertising. The second thing, you can disagree, but I think it's clear that this is what's killing them. The second thing is that if we want to try and carve out a protection for them, there are a couple ways to do it. One, as you were suggesting, is to tax the data collection. Then what the newspapers could do is fall back on something like contextual advertising. So the ad depends on what it's next to, not knowing about the user. So that could work. But the other way, if you were going to tax just digital advertising generally, is to have a very generous exemption. And so the kind of exemption amounts that, like they were talking about in Maryland, meant that no newspaper in the United States would have paid any tax under that kind of bill. So just the scale of the revenues are so different here that if there's any progressivity to it, it's not going to hurt the newspapers.
A very important, just a technical clarification. When a local newspaper sells digital advertising, they're not going to market by themselves. They're very often going via Google. So when we look at Google's overall footprint in the digital advertising market and also the role of independent ad tech companies, they are the ones that are monetizing local news content on behalf of those publishers. And so I think just disambiguating a little bit the role in the marketplace of who provides what function. As we get to data brokers, that'll be really important to understand, like how it is that a local publisher, a local news organization has appealing content and can charge premium rates. Very often depends on the role of a Google or a data broker to help them describe their audiences.
But just look at who ends up with the profit. I mean, the fact that they use Google doesn't mean that they're benefiting.
We do have a group of newspapers throughout the country that are involved in a class action lawsuit against Google. The programmatic advertising is really a mixed bag for local news because unintentionally the brand safety movement discouraged advertisers from placing ads next to content that was controversial. And so the more newspaper readership increased as we go through times of trouble, the Black Lives Matter movement, the January 6th insurrection, gay rights. Sometimes the automated placement of advertising avoids words on that page. I'm going to get myself into a not using correct terminology because I'm still in the print world. But the ad placement, the ad technology scrapes the page and looks for certain words. So when it comes across words like lesbian, for example, it decides not to place an ad on that page. So the original goal of organizations like Sleeping Giants was to defund, say, Steve Bannon's War Room website, for example. The unintentional consequence was it also defunded news organizations. And Nandini Jami, who I got to hear speak a couple of weeks ago, acknowledges that was an unforeseen consequence. But it's still an issue. There are organizations like NewsGuard that are trying to solve that, but it's not solved. So it's a mixed bag. You get revenue sometimes, but you don't get revenue other times. But we can't turn down revenue.
We have, Michael, did you want to say something there? It's like, you can probably just, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to comment, I wanted to bring in sort of another issue into this discussion that I think is relevant to the discussion we were just having a moment ago about sort of subscription revenue versus advertising revenue. You know, most of the, I mean, particularly flowing from Professor Romer's initial, New York Times op-ed on this a couple years ago, most of the discussion and most of the motivation for data taxation, or at least a substantial portion of it, has been, the kinds of things we've been talking about here about, consumer aggregation of consumer data without compensation to the consumer, corporate power in terms of the size of Google and Facebook, the externalities that flow from this data, particularly in social media, where we're talking about, depression among young people. I mean, all those kinds of sort of externality issues. But there's another whole set of issues here as well that is motivating this, and is being discussed, in a lot of quarters, which is just the whole issue, basically, that leaving aside all those issues, there's just the issue that the growth of advertising-based media is advertising-supported services is displacing things that normally would have been in the state sales tax base. I mean, I don't know why. I guess people still buy Garmin GPS devices and subscribe to Garmin, but I don't know why anyone else. I can't figure out why anyone would now that we can, that we get Google Maps for free, and people clearly are not subscribing to magazines and newspapers to the same extent they used to, because there's so much more online content available to them that's supported by advertising revenue. And just looking at how people are spending the time, people are spending time on Facebook where they might have been spending, buying pay-per-view and paying money for it. And the point is that that a lot of advertising, we're getting a lot of advertising supported services from our engagement with social media and online media in general that is displacing what not so long ago would have been sales taxable consumption. And that is another, so when more and more newspapers, for example, are being supported by advertising, less subscription revenue, in many places that subscription revenue would have been subject to sales tax, and it isn't anymore. So state and local governments have an interest, just in terms of long-term revenue erosion, in figuring out a way to tax this consumption that they're no longer paying for just to preserve their revenue.
Didn't we just hear that newspapers have always been supported by advertising revenue largely?
Yeah, he's got it backwards. And newspapers are not subject to sales tax in New York State. Neither are magazines.
Well, maybe not in New York, but I'm talking as someone with a more national perspective, where they definitely are in some places, and certainly magazines are typically supported by are supported by a mix of advertising and subscription revenue. And again, more and more magazines are saying if you don't buy a hard copy, then your subscription price is reduced, and if people pay less for what would have been a taxable subscription, there would you're losing revenue. So I think the issue is that we states and local governments have a need to monetize this unmonetized consumption as well, to preserve their revenues, and then the question sort of becomes, how do we do this without as you would rightly express concern about harming local newspapers, for example. But there's a trade-off there, because state and local governments also need revenue.
And Mike, you started to use the term excise tax, and I think that when Rob and I were working on my version of this bill, we did think of it as an excise tax, and we tried to avoid sort of defining what the different business activities of any given company might be. Just, okay, you've got X number of people downloading you or using you in our state, so we're gonna hit you with a formula of that. I just wanted more question for Rob, but is there anything that prevents us from exempting newspapers and other not-for-profit media
No, well,
from this?
not-for-profit are exempt
They're
already.
exempt anyway.
But I mean, you could, the news organizations would be one of the most likely exemptions. Somebody like the Weather Channel might show real high on the list, but how much money they're actually getting from all those viewers or something like that. So I think exemptions, are fine. And I think
Well,
we may.
Again, as you well know, Rob, I mean, you have to tread very lightly in this area because you started selectively exempting certain kinds of content, and you're starting to raise First Amendment challenge issues there. So you can certainly exempt on the basis of size. You can probably exempt on the basis of for-profit or non-profit status. But if you started moving into the area of exempting based on content, you're starting to run into First Amendment problems. I mean, and I found fascinating the discussion a minute ago about which I was aware of, but I hadn't thought of the legal implications of. But the fact that these advertising networks their algorithms are written to avoid the placement of ads near certain words on a page. In and of those algorithms, therefore, and the companies using those algorithms, therefore, potentially are subject to First Amendment based challenges because they're choosing to display advertising based on content, and that in and of itself would probably
I think we would have to stay away from all that.
I know that Jonathan wanted to get in, and then Joe as well. So let's hear from them.
Great, thanks. I don't want anyone to think for a minute that I in any way disagree with what Diane and Michael have been saying. When I attack the advertising industry, the program advertising industry, and the ad tech industry, I think they are perpetrating a fraud against publishers, against users, and against brands. That's the problem. I think this country relies on a free press. Our democracy relies on a free press. Our enlightened system of capitalism relies on a free press and an advertising model. The big problem now is not that we have an advertising model, it's that we've got nefarious brokers, data brokers, to get to your data broker point. We've got these actors in the middle who have so obfuscated the process, the system, that they are able to game the buyers and the sellers against one another, extract all of the revenue without the brands, without the sellers, without the users, without the buyers, knowing what's going on in that weird jumble in the middle. That's where the problem is. I think we've got to take the reins away from the data brokers and give that back to the people. And the way New York, I think, champions this may not be through a dirty word like taxation, as good as it is for us. But I think if New York turned itself into the place that championed users, residents, citizens, and somehow we replaced the data brokers. We became the trusted data intermediary. That's the win for New York State. That's how we, I think, paved the way for a new model where we represent our citizens. We will protect them. We will control their data. Based on our relationship and our contract with our citizens, we can determine how, where, why our data is used, and how we bring revenue back to the data. There's value in that data. That data belongs to the residents and it belongs to the representatives. So I think it's dangerous calling this a data tax. I think what we need to do is call this a data user revenue stream. And if New York could champion that somehow, become its own data intermediary, its own data trust, establish something like a data co-op where we determine what happens with our users' data. We as people. That's the win.
So this is much broader than tax policy, but
Yes.
how would you even do that? You would say to every company in the world, you're not allowed to collect anybody's data anymore?
So the way they collect data, they do it through data intermediaries. They do it through this ad tech model, or they do it through DoubleClick, they do it through Google. We turn ourselves into that new data intermediary. It may require some hurdles, but there are baby steps we can take into it. I think so.
And we say those other people can't exist anymore?
They can exist, but we'll undercut them and we'll give value back to our people. Why would any resident of New York State use a data broker or opt to use a data broker when they can use the state and know that they're going to get micropayments back or money's going to go into the coffers of the state? So, and with an understanding that the state's going to protect our data and not exploit our data. It's a complicated process. It does require a technical fix. Is it easy? I'm not sure, but there's ways we can baby step into it. You control the MTA, or at least you've got a relationship with the MTA. Could we start a test run where the MTA, which collects incredible amounts of data on us, becomes the first line of defense? We turn the MTA into a data fiduciary, a data co-op of all of the users of the MTA, and that data that isn't sold to third-party beneficiaries without the approval of the users and the state. That's a nice baby step.
Joe, you wanted to, you had your hand raised before, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm gonna go back to some of the commentary about magazines. I mean, I think that it's absolutely ruined the industry, the business model. I agree. It's been super hard for news organizations. And the lost revenues also force large and small organizations to start relying more and more on algorithms in the way they even produce their content. It's not just that they're consolidating, they're losing jobs left and right. We don't have human touch behind the news and information we see every day. And it's not on a local level. So I definitely agree that we need to figure out some way to ensure that this tax doesn't create like undue burden for certain aspects of data information. But that being said, like I think that this can really push more transparency, like I said, in the industry. As long as we can do it with reason, and I think something else to consider in that reason is time and purpose limitations or data minimization practices, for example. Perhaps there's different, like, I don't know, tax breaks, or I don't know all the language to be honest, but that you could bring into the conversation for if they have certain safeguards put into place, or they are at a certain point in the history of the data, deleting it, discarding anything so they don't have as much data on hand. Maybe there's ways that we can also come to that, because really, I think what a tax should do, for to tax data or go some other route, is really incentivize people to protect and secure the data, right? I don't think that we should punish companies just for making revenue. It should be the responsibility to managing your data as well.
To build quickly on, okay,
Paul, did you want to?
Go ahead, I'll go ahead.
To build quickly on Jonathan's point, I can't speak for New York specifically, but there are state and local government organizations that already play a role, deliberately or not, as the ground truth for data, for personal data, whether that's driver's license, DMV records, voter records, local tax records, often are pulled in and find themselves in the ecosystem of, for example, credit bureaus, and that credit bureau data is no accident. The credit bureaus themselves are either they are data brokers, or they have subsidiary data brokers. So what's interesting is that I would fully expect it's time to revisit the license agreements, by which how that data finds its way, and maybe it starts out as in the interest of fraud detection and making sure that we're not enabling fraudulent transactions, but then finds its way into the marketing and advertising ecosystems by virtue of those very large organizations that are our data controllers.
Paul? I was going to say that it's a very interesting conversation to just keep the different line threads separate. As Michael was saying, there are some arguments that suggest just generic good tax policy would involve collecting more taxes from basically these online firms. That's one argument. The different argument, which is the one I was making, which is that we're seeing things that are kind of like carbon emissions that are just bad. We want to tax the things that are bad because we want less of it. Now those first two things can go partly in a similar direction. I think, Jonathan, you're aligned with, like, I guess with me, with saying there's stuff that's bad that's going on here. It sounds like you're not as keen on using the tax measure to do it, and maybe there's another more regulatory way to do it, but I think it may be worth trying to take advantage of the tax measure because partly you get revenue, partly you fix some problems they've got on our tax system. Now, the interesting alternative discussion that's emerged is that I was saying, just go to the end of the chain, which is the revenue for selling the targeted ads. I thought it would just be like a lot of work to collect money from all the people who are trading in the data. But there might actually be some value in trying to collect money on all the data transactions because one, you might exempt or create a little bit of an option for newspapers who don't buy from data brokers but still want to just place ads. And two, you might actually have the benefit of getting more transparency about what's going on in this data economy by just forcing them to file returns. So I could see reasonable arguments going for either tax all the data, controllers and transactors, tax the advertising, or even conceivably a kind of a regulatory measure. Let's just have regulations to stop the misuse of data. But I think the regulatory path is tough.
Well, so it's interesting here, and one of the reasons we had, speaking from my office, we had kind of pursued the taxation route is because I think you can make credible arguments about whether or not data in of itself is a new type of commodity. Like when a company gets a license to drill for oil, right? They have to pay for, on public lands, let's use a very simplified example, they have to pay the public for the right to drill for that oil. And then they take that commodity, they mine that commodity, they monetize it, they sell it back to us, they pay taxes on it, they pay corporate taxes, sales tax, whatever. But for the privilege or the right to extract that public resource, they have to pay, right? And here we have a resource which is very lucrative, which is the combined, for lack of a better word, attributes or data points of all of us in this room and soon to be 8 billion people on this planet that is a rich commodity that these companies are mining without having to pay for the least privilege, so to speak, to do so in the first place, right? So there's that strain of argument that data is a form of a commodity. You can also make the case, I think, that mining of the data is almost like a form of a modern day labor analogy in that 100 years ago I would go to a factory and press the button 100 times a day and I would make a product for someone, make money for someone, but in return I would get something. Here I type a few keystrokes in my my computer and the computer knows the pattern of my keystrokes and that becomes a data point in of itself that they then sell or market, or the fact that I input into my user profile that I like XYZ ABC becomes the means by which the company makes money off of me, and I receive no compensation for that as an individual perspective, right? So I am now a laborer for big tech, big computer, whatever you want to label whoever it is, and yet I get nothing in return for it. So, thinking about both of those strains, the idea of trying to extract some value back is, I think, worthwhile as a discussion point or as a public policy point. And I don't think that forecloses the route of more stringent regulation and transparency and cleaning up the bad actors here, and also shining a light on how this whole sector of the economy works. I think you can do it through both ways. But the notion that we would continue to allow ourselves to be mined and labor for someone else's profit without any return on that, I think is highly problematic, especially as this sector of the economy is only growing by leaps and bounds, and in ways that we can't even fully contemplate yet into the future.
And I just also, I agree with my colleague here that maybe I want to try to keep it a little more simple. There is a reason why we need to actually collect revenue to run the public services that we all need to function in and survive in our state, our city, our country. And as Senator Gennardis just pointed out, we've already figured out how to take these things from individuals without paying them for it. And I don't know that we'll ever come up with a way to pay them for it, but we can at least try to have a rational, direct way to tax and bring revenue in to the state. But I really appreciate all the points on this side of the table, which I just think are so critical, but also so hard for me to envision how we could actually implement those changes in law. And just to add complications, so people on this side of the table know that I'm not big on gambling. I'm not secretive about that. Read the Times series today about sports betting and online gambling and how they have so effectively and so rapidly gone down to the most micro level of targeting college students and colleges to get everyone signed up to bet in like 2 years. And the articles terrified me because it's such a great, terrible example of how you can use technology and algorithms and targeting to radically change culture and people's behavior and where they're spending their money. And I would love to go after that, I'm just saying, to this side of the table here and to everybody, but I find that to be such an overwhelming set of challenges to put into a simplistic bill that we could actually pass, or a group of bills that we could actually pass into law in the state of New York, while I sort of, there's disagreements about how to tax, but we sort of already know the options of what are the things we can tax, how can we tax them, and will they stand up in court. And we might be having a little disagreement about what the court said about that Maryland case, but we sort of generally know the outline of how we tax things. But how we get to these much bigger, and I would argue much more serious issues, I don't want us to let go of. I'm just not sure that we will figure those out in today's roundtable.
If I should make one more point, which is, I'm just wondering, my colleagues, in looking at the issue of privacy and what it's worth and the value that it brings to the platforms. Obviously, a parallel issue is controlling one's privacy and looking at states like California that have already done that through their Privacy Act. And I know there's legislation we have in Albany that Senator Thomas carries that would create a California-style Privacy Act. I was just wondering what, that's kind of a secondary issue to the whole issue of monetization of privacy, is like whether you opt in to have your data mined in the first place. Is that, I'm just wondering,
I
Diane.
can send you our memo on that.
And what does it say?
Oh, it's something that I would have to look at again. I haven't looked at it in a while. There are some data privacy laws out there that work relatively well. Virginia is one that I hear cited. California is a bit more difficult, and the European GDPR would be very difficult to implement among news organizations in this country. But I'm not techie, so I can't get too far into
It is
weeds
kind
on
of,
that.
I think, amazing that we haven't moved any online privacy legislation in Albany. And I don't know if that's because there just isn't the concern among New Yorkers. I think I agree with my colleagues that there certainly should be, but it's definitely an area that we should, I think, explore in addition to
I think
monetizing.
Senator Thomas's bill, as I understand it, it's gone through several iterations. It's been worked on for the last couple of sessions. I think progress has been made, as I understand, in terms of getting it to a place where it might be workable. I know we have some staff here, and we can hear from him at a future date. But it's certainly, I think, as we've been working on this topic, I don't think people have forgotten about it. I just think, to your point, Brad, it's complicated. It's a lot, and I think that we have to keep doing more work on it. And I think Senator Thomas has a briefing on his bill coming up next month, so we'll get an update as to where his efforts are. I think they're on their second or third print of it already, so they are actively working on shaping it, and hopefully, I anticipate there'll be a push for it again next year.
If I could respond to Senator Kruger's point, the gambling example I think is very interesting because that points in a direction where people might be able to make money off of individual information that doesn't go through the traditional revenue, like advertising revenue channel. So that's one more argument I think in favor of tax the data collection, data, sale activity, as opposed to taxing the advertising revenue. But the other thing I'll say is I worked pretty closely with the people who were pushing the amendment in California, the constitutional amendment, which was the forcing factor to get the bill on privacy. I supported what they were doing, but I think the reality is it's been really totally ineffective. It's really hard to see how privacy, feasible privacy legislation does much. But I think starting to uncover who's making money off of your information and then maybe taxing them a little bit for doing it, that's a feasible way to go.
John?
Yeah, I think we can and should go down all of these paths in parallel. Here's my concern with the data tax approach. I think it's a good approach. I think it's very strongly, very arguably constitutional. But that doesn't mean that those who hate the statute won't forum shop and succeed in what seems on its surface a constitutional challenge. We're going to be mired for 5 years and ultimately may get a bad ruling on the constitutionality of the data tax. So I don't think we do it in isolation from the other approaches, but I think to the extent we do go the data tax route, it's got to be as simple and straightforward as possible, and we'd head on the First Amendment and the Dormant Commerce Clause and the tax free act.
Can I just say, the Maryland law was passed in a hurry, and I told them at the time, you're going to be just killed constitutionally given the way you've written it. They could have written it in a way to make it not vulnerable to all the things that they got killed on. So I agree that if you do something on taxation, just anticipate the obvious constitutional attacks and circumvent those.
And have you looked at both of our bills for a constitutional perspective?
Well, I've talked with Becky, and I think there are some things like how you define like the size is important. If you can make the size, like if you have any degree of like progressivity or high rates, if you can make that a function of things that happen in New York State rather than things in the rest of the United States or the world, I think that gives you a lot of protection. And so I think you were describing one of the bills had a tax rate that was a function of total US revenue. I think that's probably a bad idea because
2 of them.
yeah, but you can make, if you're looking to get, if you're trying to figure out who's big, if they're big in New York State, they're big in the United States, just write the law to tax big in New York State. Now the other one, and we should hear from maybe Michael on this, I think the Internet Tax Freedom Act is a mess. It's really hard to make sense. I think it could be challenged right now as being unconstitutionally vague because they talk about internet, in effect internet service providers that don't even exist anymore. So I think if you pass any tax, I would just say include a line that says any firm that is actually exempt under the Internet Tax Freedom Act doesn't have to pay tax under our bill. And then let them try and go litigate and prove that they actually are covered by the Internet Tax Freedom Act because I don't think any firm is going to qualify anymore. I don't think they fit the description that the bill targeted. And none of them have done what the bill said was required, which is they were supposed to protect children as a quid pro quo for getting this tax exemption. So I think those two things, just make all of your numbers functions of numbers from New York State and say, if you really qualify for an exemption under Internet Tax Freedom, fine, you don't have to pay our tax.
This is probably a good moment to sue regarding the constitutionality of the ITFA. The big tech has the back against the wall. This is 5 years ago. I think it would have probably failed, but I think this is the moment.
And listen, they do not want to fight right now about whether but they don't want to fight right now about whether they've done a good job of protecting children, from pornography.
I have a bill on that, actually, unrelated to the topic of this roundtable, but anyone interested in child data privacy, come see me during the break or afterwards. I know Michael wants to get in, and then I want to return to Paul's earlier question, which was a discussion point, was figuring out the universe of these companies, which I think is helpful. And so our session this morning is going to go till 12 o'clock. We're going to break for lunch for 45 minutes and then return in the afternoon to talk a little bit about Maryland and then about the details of the bills. So it's 11:30 now, just so people have some context about where we want to take the conversation.
Thank you. And a very quick comment just on Senator Hoyland's the tension between privacy and taxation. We want to avoid a situation where data minimization process, right? I want to collect and retain less data on you, actually creates a tension between taxation reporting requirements. That in order for me to know who's a New York State resident or who I'm serving ads to, that I have to retain personal information about them to even be able to file and disclose that. So we have a situation where privacy demands that we minimize retention of data, but taxation may require that we restore that connection to personal information to even know that that person's in New York. So that could create an issue.
So on that point, that's actually one of the reasons why our bill, we looked at the total revenue, to your point, Paul, but we divided by the number of New York users to get an estimation of, it's impossible to say Andrew's data is worth $1.13, Joe's data is worth $1.17, and so it's impossible to figure that out. But if we, broadly speaking, and because all this data gets lumped together anyway, if you can just get the average value based on revenue divided by the users, that would give us the closest approximation to calculating that piece.
But if I could just say, I think there's just a nuance there. I would recommend, in terms of a challenge, saying something like, what you're trying to tax is revenue collected on the basis of either collected in New York State or on the basis of data about New York State residents. Then you could say, as an implementation strategy, we'll use your total revenue in the United States multiplied by population as our estimate, but you can always rebut that estimate with your own direct data on revenue in the United States. But I just think you want to avoid putting into the law a formula that depends on revenue in the rest of the United States, because then this interstate commerce thing will hit you.
Sure. So now returning back to the question of how else do we identify the universe of people we're talking about here? Obviously, we know that there's a couple of the big ones, but there's more players in this space, whether they're data brokers or other folks along the commercial chain, if you will. How else should we be thinking about all of those other users and collectors or merchants of data, I guess is the best.
Rob, how did we imagine keeping track of what companies fell into this?
Well, we kept it pretty simple in the fact that the only collection really triggered the tax. So if you were collecting, and it has to be over 1 million customers a month, so that kind of narrows down the field. And mostly we were focused on collecting from the consumer him or herself, but it is true that we would get, if there was secondary, if Google sold it to somebody else, then that somebody else would be a data collector, and so there was that secondary route. That wouldn't be as easy to identify as the piece with the individual consumer, where we have that statistic about average monthly user. But my understanding is that Google and Facebook, a lot of what they do is from the consumer themselves. So we would get a lot of it without much question, but then as it gets into, we didn't look as hard as these different levels of data brokers, and maybe the tax department would have its hands full, and hopefully that would be a small percentage of the income that we're talking about. I just wanted to make one point. Mike talked about sales tax depletion, and that's a good point, and here's an obvious case, which is what's going on with Google and Facebook is not, it could be a taxable transaction. Even under current law, arguably you could say, well, this is a barter transaction, and I'm getting some value from Google, and I'm transmitting some value to Google, and it's very difficult item to put a value on, but arguably, if the model were different, a subscription model, we would be getting sales tax on all that. So as the model moves, and I think it's moving towards, because I heard Netflix isn't doing quite so well anymore, and they might move towards a advertising model. So, then you're going to see the revenue slip away. And so,
Amazon is definitely going for advertising too.
yeah, Amazon is making a ton of money. It makes more than Prime. But anyway, so it's not intended to really be a substitute for the sales tax, but at least the data collection, we're gonna get something on that transaction. And the way the Uber bill is written, it's actually based on per consumer. So it boils down to, for Google, they're paying basically $4 a year to have the right to an individual's data. And if there are 15 million New Yorkers that they're getting it from, that's $4 times 15 million, and that's $60 million, which, it depends which end you're looking at. If $4 sounds cheap to me for getting somebody's data. But I will tell you, the industry screamed when they did the math and they saw the number was that high. So
You can always raise the number later.
yeah.
If they want to pay more, sure.
So that is something to think about, that I think, and there is a multi-state tax commission, a group that's working on digital advertising, digital taxation more broadly, and that's an issue on there.
Just an interesting quick note there, and I'll turn it to Senator Brisport. When we had some early meetings with different stakeholders from the tech industry, including Google and Facebook, about our bill, I asked point blank, well, what is your current tax liability in New York based on your current business activities? To their credit, Google was able to point to a number. Whether that number is accurate or fair, that's a whole separate conversation. I'm not saying it's not, but obviously it doesn't encompass all of this, but they were able to point to a number. Facebook had no number that they could report, which leads me to wonder whether or not Facebook is even paying any tax for operating in New York and for being based here in New York and for conducting business here in New York. So I think that gets to kind of your point, like some of this is really opaque to understand the full nature of what these businesses are actually doing and how we are, capitalizing on those.
I would say that we reformed our corporate tax in 2014-15, and so we are getting, we do market-based sourcing. So in Europe, they were not even getting any of the money because you need a physical presence. We don't require a physical presence to create Nexus, although Google is here big time now. But there's nothing wrong with the New York corporate tax law that they can take advantage of. But the New York tax law still starts with a line from your federal return. So if the federal folks are getting hosed, then then New York is probably getting hosed. And there were some things actually during Trump's era that were supposed to help some. I don't know how they've worked out in terms of closing some of the international rules.
Yeah, I really am curious about this notion of the universe of who the players are, because I actually, before I came here this morning, I was of the impression that the big four that you mentioned earlier, Paul, sort of did it all. That Google collected and managed and sold, and that was it. So if there's this other, shadow set of organizations that are behind the scenes that we don't know their names that are also processing, I would love to know that too.
Oh, don't worry, Google will buy them and you won't have to worry about
And
it.
then, they'll just be Google.
That's what
It's
happened to
tough to run.
DoubleClick. That's why Google has such a massive
Joe,
ad tech
Joe,
infrastructure.
maybe was your hand raised as well? Or?
I was going to mention though. I think the other thing to couple their points is this is a really an illegitimate industry at this point. I think it can be legitimized in terms of its value, but the business model of these platforms is to get a bunch of data, right? They don't take the money. They actually there's all the conversation about the attention economy. It's really just about getting data, and I think that thinking through, like they were saying, different ways that we can monetize that and redistribute to the people and making it in an aggregate model allows us to have a conversation about what even is the value. Because it might be $4 a person in some places, but if you get 25 cents from 50,000 companies, you're talking $12,500 a year. I think this is a way that we can redistribute the wealth also that they've all aggregated.
And to your question, Jabari, the state of Vermont, I think, passed legislation a couple of years ago specifically on data brokers. And they have basically they start, as we understand it, because we spoke to some of the folks there, they started with the same ambitions that this conversation was, but they scaled back dramatically just to focus on the third-party data brokers. And where they ended up on their legislative front was just to have a requirement that companies register and pay a registration, fee or fine, or not fine, fee, to register to operate in the state if they are engaged in third-party data brokering practices. So that's one way of identifying like the universe. That's a starting point. I think part of the challenge is that we don't know we don't know all the universe, right? Like I think it's why you actually
They don't have to register in New York yet.
Right. Right.
Just to quickly comment on that, because I've worked with a number of these organizations, including been kind of corporate cousins to them. The business model itself isn't particularly new. I think the scale of it is new with the digital economy, but companies like Axiom that have been around for decades, they got their start in direct mail and loyalty programs. You undoubtedly, via your loyalty cards, your credit cards, you probably have a dozen relationships with data brokers like this, which are consented, whether you realize it or not. This is part of the issue of transparency. But when you have your Marriott loyalty card, what's actually running that, or Citibank, for example, has a huge relationship with companies like this, is that they are contracted over periods of years to provide data services to these very large corporations. And it's a very promiscuous category, right? A lot of companies have relationships with a lot of organizations. To the point about the example of newspapers work with data brokers. When you register with your email address on the New York Times, what they're also doing is using a data broker to link a lot of information to your email address, which increases the amount of money they can sell their advertising for. So they play a role in the organization, in the economy, which can be thought of as being, you've got these self-contained companies like Google and your Facebook. Data brokers are often used by the not Facebook and the not Google to aggregate a more complete data picture. And so in that regard, they're kind of baked in very, very formally into the way the industry works.
The Times is very protective of their first party data. That's something that they don't, you're smirking at me now. That's something that they have a great deal of discussion about, including publicly.
Just one point on tracking and information. So first, I think it's very important to be sure and steer away from anything that looks like a corporate income tax, because you don't know where income is collected, because revenue and costs are in different places. So income is going to move to the low tax jurisdiction. It never will work to have local taxes on income. But you might, instead of just taxing revenue, you might start to think a little bit about some kind of a value-added type tax, because that might actually, so that somebody who buys data tells you, okay, well, I spent this amount for the data, then I sold it for this other amount, and you tax the difference. One reason you might like that is that you actually would get more information about these chains of data flows. So I talked with Becky about this. You could think of some kind of value-added kind of element to this, mainly because of the information it would surface. But I still think that at the end of the day, all of the money ends up at Amazon, Facebook, and Google. And if you're going to collect revenue, it's going to come from them.
And again, sorry to sound like pitching my bill, but I know my bill better. So in our bill, it doesn't matter where you physically are, you can't threaten to leave because we still collect the money from you. But perhaps that's also true with your bill.
Yeah, our bill is based. Yeah, correct.
But that's because it's wherever you are, you're using data about New York.
Not New York customers. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because falling into a pattern where somebody says we'll all leave, it's like it's very convenient to be able to say, yeah, that's not really relevant. Thank you, unless you're sending not to work with New Yorkers and they're 20 million of us. So it's really unlikely everybody's going to say no, we're not interested in New Yorkers.
So, Michael, did you want to chime in there?
I'm a little puzzled by some of the discussion about the relationship between, imposing the tax and issues of sort of transparency for the industry or transparency for the public about who's collecting their data and how it's being aggregated. And I would just point out that, that in most states, there's a very explicit firewall between information that's collected by a revenue department for tax purposes and potential interest of other regulatory agencies in the state of that same information for other kinds of issues like consumer protection or any other reason. So, without without sort of explicitly including in legislation like this language that would allow the sharing of this information with, you know, whatever agency in the state might be charged with, you know, or with protecting consumer privacy, that's just not going to happen. And of course, you know, the inclusion of such language allowing the sharing of that information with either another regulatory body in the state or state legislators interested in, you know, understanding the industry better for other ancillary regulatory concerns, or let alone with the public, it's just going to raise the opposition to this kind of legislation.
But Michael, you could use like tax data to provide aggregate information about an industry as long as you don't identify the amounts associated with individual firms. And we do this with our national tax data as well.
You could. I would just say that sort of in my experience, the utility of aggregated data, even the utility for aggregated state tax-related data, even for making state tax policy or making an argument for changing state tax policy, in my experience, is pretty limited. Let alone being able to use it very much for non-tax related issues. And so, I mean, that's the reason why I've long been an advocate of, and Rob has too, for changing the law to make this tax-related information company specific, publicly available, because the aggregated data is kind of you know, the use of aggregated data is not as difficult to kind of make a lot of political hay of. I mean, I agree. You know, but you know, just I mean, you know, the issue is just raised, like, is Facebook actually paying any tax to New York? Well, you know, under current law, you can't make that public. So, you know. Anyway, I just wanted to say I'm a little puzzled by the faith that you know that the tax information is also going to be very useful for sort of broader issues, accountability outside the tax.
Yeah, I think the relevant expression is that in the land of the blind, the one-eyed person is king. So. But Michael, would you comment at all on whether my harsh assessment of the Internet Tax Freedom Act is right? I mean, does that act, if firms actually had to prove that they were exempt under that act, could any firm qualify right now?
Well, you know, the child protection issue, I mean, again, this it all comes down ultimately to litigation, right? And you know, I you know, there's a credible argument that they're not, you know, I haven't looked at the child protection language in it for a real long time, so it's never really been an issue at all in the tax field. I mean, no state that is litigated, no state that is litigated, including Maryland, to my knowledge. I mean, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people who have been briefs.
But I think the mistake in Maryland is they didn't acknowledge the possibility that a firm might be exempt under the Internet Tax Freedom Act. But I think if they just said that, like, if you're exempt under Internet Tax Freedom, then you don't pay under us, then it forces the firms to show that they qualify under that. I don't think there's been any litigation that shows that anybody qualifies under it.
Well, I think what would happen would be that companies would, all of the companies would say, yeah, we claim protection under the Internet Tax Freedom Act, but then it would be up to the state to audit.
But then they have to go to court. They have to go to court and prove that they're doing things to protect children, and they're gonna lose.
No, they don't. I mean, it's self-enforcing. They read the law and say we take the position that we're doing what we need to
No. If New York State says no Facebook, you don't qualify for this exemption because we don't think the facts are that you've done what you're supposed to do to protect children. Then New York State takes Facebook to court and Facebook has to prove that they qualify.
Well, yes, exactly. But again, what's going to happen is all these companies are going to take the position they're doing with the school, and New York is going to have to take one of them to court and litigate it.
And I would love to be part of that lawsuit. Facebook about whether it's really protecting children. I mean, they'd get killed.
Whatever you're talking about, I mean, how long did it take to get a Supreme Court, New York Supreme Court, High Court?
New York passed what we call the Amazon
On
law.
Amazon, from the time
We got sued in
the time
April.
you enacted the click-through law to the time you got a Supreme
Right.
Court decision
We got sued in a hurry by Amazon and in April of 2008. And I think we got a decision where the Supreme Court didn't take the case in December of 2013. So about 5.5 years or something.
But you might also they might fail to get. They want an injunction that says you can't collect it until it's decided, but they may not win that case. You can collect the tax until it's finally decided.
Amazon was actually paying for it because they couldn't afford to not pay.
I think the better solution is to try to write a law that does not, where you have a much stronger case that the law from the outset is not violating the internet tax refund. And
I would say that the discussion among academics was probably tilted a little bit in favor of Maryland losing. There were some people who were nobody talked about children.
That was
so I'm
because
not
it was written the wrong way. They wrote it so they were would put a bullseye on them. Of course.
Well, we took a shot, Senator Kruger and I, and Cost has, I don't know if you know Cost, but they're the main lobbyist for large large corporations across the states, and they have, been pretty quiet in the discussions of what's wrong with Senator Kruger's bill about the constitutionality issue or about the Internet Tax Freedom Act. They've focused on other things to the best they could, mostly about how much it was going to cost, which they thought was very bad, and we don't think so.
But Michael, I think that the honest answer, that the way to write a bill which avoids a fight with the Internet Tax Freedom Act is just put in a provision that says if a firm qualifies for an exemption on the basis of the Internet Tax Freedom Act, this tax doesn't apply. That's all you have to do.
Right, and that's right, and you'll end up with a 5-year litigation because none of the companies will comply.
I'm telling you, Google and Facebook do not want to have litigation about whether or not they've been protecting children. They would rather pay the tax than go to court over that.
Well, I guess the good thing is no matter what outcome comes from this conversation, there's going to be litigation. So there will be challenges for sure. So I think all of these things are fair questions. We just have a couple minutes left in our morning session. I just want to are there any parts of this industry, of this sector of the economy, or this conversation that we've left kind of unturned at this point? Because in the afternoon we're going to go a little bit deeper. So I want to make sure that from a foundational perspective we're not missing any points or considerations as we kind of wrap up.
I was still a little confused, Jonathan, when you're talking about these bad guys, are they collecting a lot of data from what they do? I mean, they put all these ads up and you gotta
Most of them are, the data brokers for the most part are collecting and disseminating the data for all sorts of purposes. Some of them aren't. Some of them are just serving as a middleman and using the data that the supply side folks are sending to them. So Google may be sending them the data, but sending them which publishers they want ads, but not sending them the data itself.
So if your tax is based on collecting data from a certain amount of New York consumers, that doesn't necessarily get at those guys.
I think it may depend on where you are in the ad tech flow.
I'm also wondering though, so we had the Vermont data broker. How well has that gone so far? Because I feel like trying to find data brokers is going to be like trying to pull holes out of the ground.
Sure.
know that it's gonna be that easy, right?
Well, just to comment on that, I mean, quickly, it's like if you look at this from this perspective, if you were a business looking to buy these services,
Yeah.
and you look at the industry analysts, the Forresters, the Gartners, they review these companies, right? You'll find lists of those that have won awards, those that have gotten recognition. So if you flip the table and look at it that way, another good example is when you have a DSP console. If you're looking to buy programmatic display ads, you can see all the different audience segments that are available to you to target against. So all these things are some of it's kind of in plain sight. Because in order to have these available for purchase, you have to list them publicly.
Sure.
In a lot of cases, these types of data and the providers of that data.
But the problem is a ton of fraud going on in these
Oh,
spaces,
yes,
and
absolutely.
they are, to a large extent, even making up the statistics about their end users.
Well, I think there's fraud in a number of there's fraud all different places in the programmatic industry, and in which cases the publishers and the advertisers themselves can both find themselves losing a lot of money. So part of this questions we might get to is what's the event you actually tax? Is it if it's around activation and it's a fraudulent activation, like how you're figuring out, did a human actually receive it? Is it actually profiling a human at all? Or are you actually profiling a bot? Is a whole other question here on identifying the number of users.
So in these bills, I guess who is tasked with figuring out who gets taxed?
We're taking volunteers. So I think
honestly, you want me to make a list?
I'll let Becky.
I can answer that.
Yeah.
Sure. So in our bill, S6727 Gunardis, a huge part of the bill is that they have to register first with this newly created Office of Consumer Data Protection, which would be composed of subject area experts. Huge part of the bill, figuring out who all of these actors are. Data controller, everybody who has the data processor, anybody profiting anywhere along this transaction chain covered under our bill. That was raised just a moment ago, so I want to clarify that. Then Tax and Finance takes that list from Office of Consumer Data Protection and levies the tax. By my reading the Genaris bill and the Kruger bill, it would just be Department of Tax and Finance that is responsible for sort of identifying these companies. I think in at least the Genaris bill, possibly the Kruger bill as well, there is some onus on the company, however, to know whether or not they have to file that return and that they're liable for the tax, because they need to know their own revenues and where that revenue is coming from.
And if a company is supposed to, I guess, register and they don't, is there like
in our bill there are fines. In the Genaris bill there's a misdemeanor, and in the Kruger bill it doesn't reference new penalties. There are all sorts of existing penalties in tax law that would apply.
Got it.
But this is the same thing, like even sales tax. You know, there can be New York State law about sales tax, and then it says firms have to pay a sales tax. It's up to the firms to know if they're doing things that force them to owe money to New York State. And you know, some of them won't make those filings, but then you have audits and enforcement. So,
Can we audit this sector? Is it possible for a third party to know X company is out of compliance because they are collecting information and not?
it might make sense to think about allocating some revenue that's collected from this for auditing purposes, because this may be something where you can't just rely on the lines you get from the federal returns. You may need to develop your own audit.
I think it's definitely feasible, but at this point in history, it's very time intensive and expensive. And it's not been a great way to standardize it quite yet, so not as repeatable, harder to maintain. It's getting better, don't get me wrong, I would agree, but yes, I do think that would be a hurdle to overcome, but it's definitely doable.
Certainly New York State audits corporate taxes that they think there's a problem. So I have another bill I'm waiting for the governor to sign, because if you fraudulently as a corporation file taxes, we can penalize you. But if you skip filing completely, then we can't.
Right.
Which I think is a crazy loophole.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping the governor signs the bill this
Does
year.
that work for individuals too?
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Above a certain income, yes.
My only-
If you're not in New York State, but you do business here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
my only word of caution on this is
Yeah.
because I think different from a normal income tax liability, because the best practice is to minimize, is to scrub, is to delete personally identifiable references to the data in the industry, that might create issues for an audit trail because of the desire to minimize data retention. If that makes sense.
I mean,
I don't think
I
it would be
find
a
this
problem
argument
for our
really
bill, but-
disingenuous, because you're trying to say the industry is doing this great job of not retaining data about individuals and don't pass a tax law that would actually force them to start keeping it.
To clarify.
But in fact, the industry is keeping an enormous amount of data about every one of us. So the fact that they're not collecting like information about us as the thing that exists that you want to protect, I think is absurd.
To be clear, I'm not at all saying the industry is doing a good job of this. What I'm saying is that there are regulations in place that require that data be deleted or obscured or encrypted. So that's, for example, compliance with GDPR, it in many cases requires that type, you have to retain consent, but other forms of data you must delete.
I think what you're really getting at though is if companies were to follow through on the best practices that they should uphold,
Yes.
which they don't fully right now.
And
But
they're
if
not,
they
they're
did,
not going to, but
I agree. But I think what you're saying is if they did actually follow through, then this law would be requiring them to actually put some of that.
So right to forget, for example,
I agree.
but it's really disingenuous. I mean, the idea that this is somehow like avoiding this tax is going to lead to less collection of information about individuals. It just got the sign exactly
Well, I
wrong.
guess I would
It was about
say,
compliance with other regulations.
and I want to get to Colin to close us out, but I guess the question I would pose, which we don't have to answer now, is, setting aside, so you can scrub personally identifiable information so that, user X who, some other example, likes Led Zeppelin, the color blue, and Greek food, you don't know that that's Andrew. You know that's
Now
user
we
X.
do.
Now you do, right? right?
Just know what
Whatever
else
was
to
on
do.
my iPod this morning, right? And whatever I had for dinner last night. But identifying the identity of that user, which is almost irrelevant to the marketing of that information. Like, the company doesn't care that they're coming to Andrew. They care that they're coming to a consumer with those tastes, or with those likes or those attributes or whatever. You don't have to retain the identity of that user in order to still keep that information and monetize that information. And I think for a accounting purpose or a sector regulation purpose, the identifying information is not important as so much as the commodified data points, right? So I understand your point about how companies are trying to hold less data, but they're still holding
They're not
the most
trying
valuable.
To. They're supposed to hold less data, but
Well,
they're not
whatever
trying
it is,
to.
but the value is not in the personal piece of that.
So I understand the principle. The difficulty is, for example, in verifying whether a person is a human or a bot. So the mechanism by which you do that requires you be able to analyze quite a bit of data about them to determine whether that is actually a human.
But that's irrelevant for anything based on revenue.
But that's also why I've kind of been saying, like, I think it's smart to avoid like an advertising on the tax or something like that, because it's really about the scale of the data and the controls around it, things like that I think are the bigger concern here. I think somehow we can get to more of an aggregate level. We actually don't even have to go into.
So I want to bring Colin into the conversation. He's been patient for 2 hours. This is his Colin.
I'll be brief since I know I'm between us a bunch, and this may be a little bit far afield, but given the fact that we have concerns about whether or not they're, what type of tax, how are we going to calculate that, given the concerns about the inherent contradiction between data minimization and, retaining your records in order to prove the tax at the end of the day. I'm just throwing this out because this is an issue that we dealt with in Oklahoma, and I don't know New York law, but instead of identifying it as a tax, and given the fact that one of these bills stands up a Consumer Data Protection Agency, is it possible to create a fee? And in that regard, you show us your tax return, okay, and we can have a tiered system or however you want to do it, but all right, you made $1 billion worth of revenue, divide that by the number of New York citizens, your licensure fee in order to collect data, period, from anybody in the state of Oklahoma is X million dollars. That all goes over to the agency as a fee in order to help fund that agency and their oversight requirements, and then you don't have a tax. You know the number up front. You can do it so that smaller entities pay a less percentage of the fee up front. That's just something that I was thinking of to maybe do a run around several of these issues.
Fair point. So we are finished our morning session. I want to thank everyone for a good, lively, and interesting conversation. We're going to break for about 45 minutes and return here at 12:45. Our goal is to start as close to 12:45 as possible, which means not 1:15, not 1:30, but we know how things go. But we want to start as close to 12:45 as possible, and we're slated to go through until 3 o'clock. We're going to do a deeper dive into the particulars of the bills. We're going to talk about Maryland, but I think we're going to start the conversation as we do this deep dive with kind of where we just left this off about where in the chain does it make sense to kind of start this work. So that'll be where we kind of pick up the conversation. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you back here in a little bit.
Started in February 2021, so about a year ago. And then, almost immediately upon enactment, faced a number of state and federal level challenges in court from the industry. I believe Comcast and Verizon brought one suit, and there was sort of a coalition of industry groups, including NetChoice, that brought the other suit. I'm going to run through really briefly again, just to make sure we're on the same page when we do talk about these legal principles, the grounds on which this law was challenged. So first, we have the Dormant Commerce Clause. This is the part of the U.S. Constitution that bars state protectionism. It says that you cannot pass a law at the state level that in any way infringes upon or unduly burdens interstate or international commerce. The Commerce Clause is implicated in the Maryland digital ad tax for a couple reasons. One of them, again, being that even though you're only taxing the assessable base of Maryland digital ad revenue, the rate is based on global annual revenue, whether or not that happened in-state, out-of-state, from digital ads, from something else. So they allege that based on that, it was discriminatory towards out-of-state commerce, and also that this bill unconstitutionally regulated both in-state and out-of-state commerce, which states cannot do under the Commerce Clause. There's also the Supremacy Clause. This is fairly straightforward. This is the part of the U.S. Constitution that says that if they're already doing it, we can't. If there's a constitutionally deferred power at the federal level, states cannot enact laws that interfere with federal government powers. They cannot assume any function that the federal government already exclusively performs. This could be express preemption, written clearly in statute. This could be implied preemption. This could be field preemption. The Supremacy Clause is indicated in the digital ad tax because you could argue that it conflicts with existing statutes, such as, for example, the Internet Tax Freedom Act. Plaintiffs also alleged that the digital ad tax violated due process clause. This is the part of the U.S. Constitution that prohibits, quote, deprivation of life, liberty, or property by the government except as authorized by law. Specifically, it's frequently invoked to bar or to void statutes that are too vague for the average person to understand. That's the standard. And so plaintiffs alleged here that this law was too vague for the average person to understand, violates the due process clause. Second to last, we have the First Amendment, which we likely already know what that is. This is where the exemption of broadcast, TV, radio, newspapers comes into play, because in exempting them from the digital ad tax, what plaintiffs were alleging is that now you're not speech neutral. You're discriminating against one form of speech versus another, and so that violates the First Amendment. And then lastly, this is a statutory and not a constitutional concern, but Congress did pass the Internet Tax Freedom Act. I believe it was first drafted in the late 90s, made permanent in 2016. This is a very, very important statute that prohibits taxes on internet access is one part of it. Another part is that you can't pass multiple discriminatory taxes on electronic commerce. So if another state is taxing it, you can't also tax it without providing some kind of, let's say, offsetting credit. Plaintiffs alleged that the Maryland digital ad tax violated the Internet Tax Freedom Act. Another thing that IFTA does is it says that states can't create tax obligations that apply differently to electronic commerce versus that commerce's non-electronic brick and mortar counterpart. And so because the Maryland law did not also apply to, quote, similar situated business models that were non-electronic, they violated that it alleged IFTA. And I'm running through all of these allegations because this law was recently struck down on October 17th, 2020 on 3 grounds. And of course, there are lots of legal scholars in the room. If there's something I missed, feel free to correct me. But the 3 grounds that I saw were Commerce Clause, First Amendment Internet Tax Freedom Act, or IFTA. So it was defeated and is pending appeal by the Maryland Attorney General, Brian Frosch. That's it.
Everyone got that, right? So we're gonna have a quiz on the morning tax rates and a quiz now on the Dormant Commerce Clause implications. So I know, Paul, you had a couple of thoughts earlier on today about the Maryland court case. What do you think, if I just start the discussion point, based on the Maryland statute, the legal arguments, and the court ruling, what's the takeaway you think for us to think about in the context of the larger conversation we've been having, which is not exclusively on advertising?
Well, I think the first one Becky alluded to, which is I think it would be a mistake to make any part of the formula that determines how much a firm owes to New York State depend on their revenue in the rest of the United States or in Europe or the rest of the world. And so this was just a you know, they just shot themselves in the foot in Maryland by doing it this way. And they were actually trying to make it, you know, easier to understand. You can understand scale at the global level more easily than you can scale within Maryland. But scale within Maryland is a perfectly good way if you want something like a progressive system where rates get higher if you're bigger, you just use the scale of revenue collected within Maryland. So I would just say do not put anything in one of your bills that makes the calculation of the tax owed a function of activities that a firm engages in other states or other parts of the world. I think that's easy to avoid. I think part of why this gets complicated is the firms will say, we don't know where we're getting our revenue from, so you have to make it like a portion based on, you know, our U.S. revenue. But that's just like a sand trap, because they get you to write the law that way, and then they can overturn it based on the interstate commerce clause. At the point, it's like when New York State says to me, Paul, you have to pay tax on your income in New York State. It's my job to know what my income in New York State is and my income in other places, and I have to file a return. And so I think that if the firms say, we don't know how much revenue we collect in New York State, you just tell them, well, that's your business. And, you know, you're going to pay tax, and it's an enforcement detail. If you just come to the tax authorities and say, we have no idea how much revenue we have, would be as if I filed a return with New York State and said, I don't know what my New York State income tax is. The state would say, okay, fine, here's how much tax you're going to pay. So I don't be deterred by their claims that they don't know, because the truth is they do know. But so then I think that's the most important part of this. The other thing is this issue of the Internet Tax Freedom Act. The Internet Tax Freedom Act is a very complicated and vague, probably out of date measure, because it refers to internet access and internet service providers. But the critical part of it is that it exempts the moratorium on taxes only for firms as a quid pro quo for their putting in place measures that will protect young people from harmful content. So to qualify for protection of the moratorium under the Internet Tax Freedom Act, you've got to show as a firm that you've done these things to protect children. And the reality is the firms that are going to pay this tax, like Google and Facebook, they have FTC actions against them for predatory behavior directed at children. So I do not think the big firms who are going to pay tax under any such bill will qualify under Internet Tax Freedom. So I would just put into the law a statement that if a firm qualifies for an exemption from tax based on the Internet Tax Freedom Act, then they don't have to pay any of these new taxes to New York State. But then if they file a return and say, hey, we're exempt, we're covered by Internet Tax Freedom, then if the enforcement authorities say, well, we don't actually think you're covered, and we're going to go to court, and we're going to see. So I think with those two steps, you can avoid almost all of the challenges here. The other issues, you know, there's an argument about whether or not, say, you're violating free speech by targeting some forms or other forms, or specifically making it contingent on the internet. I think if you want to tax targeted digital advertising, which is ads that are served to particular individuals based on knowledge about those individuals, you don't have to limit that to ads that are served that way on the internet. You know, in principle, somebody could be sending you, you know, mailers through the post office that target ads to you based on data that they've collected. I think you'd say, fine, we'll tax the targeted advertising based on all of this data about individuals. We'll tax that however it's delivered. The reality is almost all of it's delivered through the internet, but I don't think you have to actually require that in the law. So I think with a few steps like this, you could tax advertising if you want. You could decide to tax the data activities that feed the targeted advertising. But most of what's going on right now is lobbyists that are scaring state legislators and saying, don't even try to pass a bill like this because we'll roll over you. And I think the legislators need to just say, well, we don't actually think we've got a basis for doing that. Or we can write our bill so that you don't have the basis for doing it.
All right. So I agree with everything you're saying, Paul, about I don't think any of these companies have done a great job of protecting youth. But like it seems like the judge in like this Maryland decision I'm reading used a violation of the Tax Freedom Act to strike down a law, even though these companies technically don't qualify for it.
But they didn't put in the kind of statement that I think would protect you. Because if you just said to the judge, if anybody qualifies under the Internet Tax Freedom Act, then they won't pay taxes under this law.
If that gets it under, I think that's a really interesting and powerful approach to it.
You see what I mean? It's like the judge is saying, well, you're interfering with the federal government's ability to put these provisions in the law. So, you know, we're not going to interfere with them at all. If somebody qualifies under the federal law, we won't tax them. But then they have to prove that they qualify, and they won't.
So you listed a whole number of categories that the court said. And the one that I remembered when I first read about the decision was the one that said, if you're not going to tax all forms of advertising, you can't tax digital advertising.
Right.
And I don't see how that relates to the case, the storyline you're referencing.
Well, but that's where I was saying that what you want to do is tax advertising which is targeted. So you're using information about the individuals to decide what advertisements they're presented with. So if you tax targeted advertising, you could frame it that way rather than saying digital advertising.
So if my advertising is targeting children to make me, the mom, buy them candy-covered cereal, but some is internet targeting of kids and some of it is TV commercials for kids, how do you define those two as being different?
Well, if you want to kind of go down this path, what you can do is refer to basically contextual advertising, where there's some content that attracts people, and then based on that context, you show them an ad. That's different from, we know that Billy is 7, and he's got a friend, Sarah, who's 9, and he bought a Power Ranger last week, and we're going to show this ad. So there's the kind of the contextual ads versus the ads that are based on individual specific information. And so then a cable TV ad, which doesn't know, the specifics of each viewer, wouldn't be taxed under that approach.
So I listened to your listing of all the things the court said, and I just say it will be hard to rewrite this bill in a way that we've covered everything that the judges threw this bill out upon. Bad English, sorry, but you know what I mean.
And I'm asking from a tax perspective too, because I don't know the actual answer to this, but to me, taxing advertising data is like taxing maple instead of some other wood. It's just a type of data, right? Advertising is a way that it's used, but there are a lot of ways that it's used. I really liked in your bill that you came into the 5 cents per consumer per month, or 2.25 million plus 50 cents. I'm wondering if there's a way that we can require disclosure of the quantity of data that a platform is either collecting, controlling, processing, or all, and then add maybe it's 1/10 of a penny per, or it's a number that's pretty minuscule, but at the scale of some of these companies becomes a significant amount of revenue that comes out. And then you're taxing volumes of an asset class rather than an activity. And maybe you get away from that discrimination, I don't know. Similar, like you tax cigarettes.
When we
In terms of the economic impact, and the huge, wealth and income flows that we've seen mobilized by data all have to do with targeting particular individuals with advertising. There is Marriott that has a frequent stayer program, but there's the dollars there are just too small. So it's targeted advertising that is the pot of gold that is motivating all of the traffic.
A quick comment about the mechanics of paying for this data. When you plan a campaign and you want to target via third-party data, there's an upcharge. Like there's a 25 cents, 50 cents CPM upcharge, like cost per 1,000 uniques that you're delivering. And so one of the moments of kind of where data value is currently metered in the programmatic space is where there are already these upcharges. That's also where things like viewability and brand safety also kind of take place at that moment. So as we're talking about what makes addressable media, whether it's display, video, or connected TV or OTT, all those things have that same kind of mechanism of upcharges, which are treated as like an ad tech cost.
So we debated, what's the best measure. Value couldn't figure out value, that didn't make sense. So then it came down between volume and sort of a head count, and we wound up with head count. Volume, it seems like, they suck up all the data they can, whether it's worth anything or whether it's worth nothing, and maybe taxing somebody based on volume would therefore, not relate to value in any way, whereas headcount a little better, particularly because the industry seems to value headcount as a way to measure how much they're going to pay for their advertising. And also, I don't think the tax department, is comfortable with gigabytes and terabytes, or I'm not sure how we would go about that. But I understand it might be nice to get a little fringe benefit, imposed based on volume, but it triggers some new issues for the administrator.
And that was one of our discussion points when we first started, when my office first started working with Joe, was on how do we identify those data points and then quantify them individually. And I ran into a bit of a wall there. Even though we wanted to get a better handle on the scope and scale and totality of this data sucking, operation basically. And to your point, like a lot of this data is collected and has no value yet, right? But it might in a future iteration, or might not have value for the first person that has it in the chain. Maybe three custodians down the road, there might be a total different use for it or value to it there, which is hard to capture.
Well, even if you don't care about the volume of it, there are predictable categories, right? There's demographic data, behavioral data, psychographic data, purchase data. All these things, at the categorical level, there is like a known usage.
And they're starting to document that more and more. It's not to the granular level I think that they should be obligated to through a lot of modern privacy law, but I think that they are at least getting to the point where categories are becoming more transparent in their policies. So it is a lever that you could.
If I could suggest one direction you might try to, if you want to explore advertising, one of the things you might do is have a conversation with the newspapers and the TV stations who've had a revenue model based on advertising that didn't involve tracking individuals, and see if they would get on board with a tax measure which taxed the targeted advertising as opposed to the contextual advertising. And they could help you. They could help
And
you.
the answer would be no.
Okay, why?
Because the world has changed. If you tax the new source of revenue that we're trying to use to replace the old source of revenue, which is nice ink on beautiful, expensive paper.
But no, it would be ads that are a function of the content that it's next to, not based on the characteristics of the person.
I think you're trying to turn back the clock. I mean, like I said before, if you wanted to turn back the clock to 1985.
Okay, well, if the newspapers.
We're in favor of that,
if
because it was a better time
position
for us.
is they're not gonna support anything, then you have to decide, are you going to, draw the distinction between the kind of the targeted advertising versus not, or you wanna try and just tax the intermediaries.
And I also think like the newspapers used to make a lot of money off their advertising for sure, but the reason why we didn't get into the vicious cycles and the hype cycles and all the virality really is because you also had another business model, which was subscriptions. And it allowed you to not rely solely on advertising.
No,
I think
but
that's the core problem.
It was 85% advertising.
Still, I mean, I don't know. You used to have contextual ads, right? Based on like what he's saying, the content that was there. TV, right? Like it was midstream of a live stream that everybody got. And
There also weren't a lot of diverse choices in media at the time. I think what the benefit that we have now is also a tremendous. The downside is fragmentation. The benefit is being able to represent a lot of
But if you
different
don't, if
viewpoints.
you don't like the world this is creating, what you can do is use the tax system to encourage the world that we liked, that supported newspapers, and didn't involve tracking information about whether Joey bought a Power Ranger. So,
But we do use the data that we collect. Some news organizations use the data in order to know how to price subscriptions, in order to know how to attract readers, to attract subscribers. Like with people complain about paywalls, which is a subscription. And sometimes when people hit a paywall, that's it. They just bounce back off your website and they're gone, and you never get any data or any revenue from that reader. But the more sophisticated paywalls collect some information about what types of articles you read. Maybe we can give you a newsletter written by your favorite reporter, and would you subscribe if we threw that in? You know, are you more interested in national politics? Can we entice you by giving you free access to our podcasts?
but I think under this choice here, if you're taxing targeted advertising, you could use your information about how your customers do or don't bounce off the paywall. But if you're just taxing the business of collecting information for purposes of making revenue, you're going to get taxed for collecting that information on your news.
I was offered 2 points here. Number one, when we were drafting our bill, one of the things that we kind of carved out was data collection or use of data that's incidental to the commercial purpose. And the example that we had used in describing it that I think also applies in the newspaper context, I have to input some data when I access my bank account on my phone, right? That's personal data that I'm giving Chase or Schwab or Citi, whatever, not for the purposes of them then selling me more financial products, but just to access my stuff, right? So that is an acceptable use of the collection of data, whether it's your birthday or Social Security, or similarly, if I'm trying to log into a newspaper website and they track that I like to read, articles about the economy or the stock market, and then they send me a pop-up saying, do you want to subscribe to our financial reporters morning updates? That to me, if I'm not being upcharged for that additional product, would be, I think, an acceptable use under how we had kind of thought about our bill. The other piece I want to add here, which is I think a little bit related as we're talking about subscription models and accessing information, which is I think a small part of this larger conversation we're having, is a point that I saw online recently about the difference in the ideological sharing and paywalling of information, and that more left-leaning sites and publications tend to paywall, right? Because they get to pay for a subscription to the New Republic or the New York or the New York Times or whatever. Whereas a lot of right-leaning information sites don't have those same paywalls, and it creates this great big power and information asymmetry, especially as it gets reshared through things like Twitter and Facebook. Democratizing news and information and media, you're going to gravitate towards the places where it's easiest to get that information. So my concern in all of this conversation would be you have wealthy individuals with ideological persuasions, one side or the other, willing to pay for the free release of this information as a loss leader almost, right? In exchange for being able to put their spin on what they want to put out versus paywalled news sources or information sources. What I worry that I would add to the further, polarization and politicization of media and all these other things that we've been living through the last couple of years.
We could have like an all-day conversation
Right,
about
sure,
that.
right. So, like, with
Just
this-
me.
So the notion that we can, just move back or pay more for accessing is, well, I think that might make sense in the Facebook model. Would I pay X dollars a month for Facebook if I didn't have my life sold to other people? You can have that argument. I think that's a different argument than would I pay more to access the New York Times if they didn't sell me ads. I think those are very different conversations and have very different considerations and implications.
Yeah, and the reason is that professional journalists want to make a living, and you have to pay them, and the best ones get paid very well. The younger ones just out of school don't get paid all that well, but you pay them, and you're paying their benefits, and the money has to come from somewhere. You know, if you're a sort of a peak slime website, which is the term that we use in the industry, the free, the content farms, the pay to play. There's a guy named Brian Timpone from Chicago who publishes a lot of these, and then you don't have to pay journalists. You don't have to pay journalists to run Facebook. You don't have to pay journalists to run a content farm. So those are free, and the information is low quality. And yes, I agree that a lot of people get information that way.
But if
Michael,
you
I wanna bring Michael in.
If you want to just understand how really toxic this advertising model is, a bunch of the early sites in this space were actually like parody sites and sarcasm sites making fun of Trump by trying to be more and more, kind of outlandish. But then they started to realize they were making so much money on advertising that they actually took it seriously and became, like MAGA sites just to make money on it. So we've kind of weaponized, some very bad tendencies in terms of content provision.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to go back a little bit to the legal issues that sort of got us into this conversation. I mean, I agree that the constitutional issues are probably the easier ones to deal with. I agree with Mr. Romer, you absolutely don't want to base this on, base the tax rate or measure of the tax in any way on non-New York activity, because that raises Commerce Clause discrimination issues. You don't want to distinguish between like cable advertising. You don't want to give an exemption for cable advertising or newspaper publishing as compared to online advertising, because that raises First Amendment issues. So the constitutional issues, I think you can handle pretty well. The Internet Tax Freedom Act issue, I think, is more challenging. I mean, I did go back while we were all eating lunch and looked at the Internet Tax Freedom Act language with respect to protection of children from, pornographic content. There's a very broad carve out there's clearly a very broad carve out for that I think would cover Google. I think arguably the same carve out covers Facebook. So I don't think
Is that the section 230 like carve out?
Well, I'll read the language. I mean, I have it here in front of me. It basically says, there's a carve out for this provision. There's a definition of being, commercial purposes, and it says. Yeah, and there's a carve out. There is a carve out for this protection of children does not apply to companies that are engaged in providing an internet information location tool. And that definition means a service that refers or links user to an online location in the World Wide Web. Such term includes directories, indices, references, pointers, and hypertext links. So I think that language basically says that if all that your company is doing is providing links to harmful content, but it's not actually providing the content itself as a seller, that you're not covered by this provision that exempts you completely from the Internet Tax Freedom Act if you're failing to protect children. So I mean, again, you know, we litigate it, but I think the companies, you know, the Google and Facebook have very, you know, plausible legal claims that they're not covered by that provision. I mean, I'm sure that's why they got put in there from the get-go, because and so I don't think that solution. I don't think that's going to be helpful. I do agree. You know, I think it would be challenging to write a definition of the advertising that is subject to this that is limited to targeted advertising. I think that's a, you know, a promising approach. I think it could be challenging, but I think it's doable. You know, it's certainly worth exploring to try to write a definition that distinguishes between targeted and non-targeted advertising.
Michael, can I just point out, like, if you think about the key,
if 95% of the you know, if 80% of the revenue that's being generated, you know, from advertising is coming from online advertising, and only 20% is coming from targeted advertising from your insurance, you know, from your credit card company or something, you know, you might have an issue. But I think that is a possible approach. It would need more work.
on the first point though, if you look at YouTube, I don't think YouTube is going to qualify, because this provision was trying to carve out like bulletin boards, and you know, you can't say that YouTube is just passively providing links to other things on the internet. So I really don't think this is as broad as you're saying.
If the mission of this is to improve like integrity of the information, suppose, right? Like, because with journalism you have cost in having an editorial staff and being responsible. Maybe there's another approach to where like we have to have for a scale of a platform X number of users, they have to have X number of like editors or something that holds them responsible. I don't know, because I do think that's
But I think what we're talking about is kind of a narrow question, which is given what this law says, who's exempt and who's not. And there is a kind of an exemption. You don't have to like protect children if all you're doing is giving access to the internet, or all you're doing is like being just like a bulletin board with a bunch of links. But if you're curating and cultivating content and trying to attract users, I don't think they're exempt under this provision.
In the YouTube case, they're owned by Google to begin with, and so it would fall through Google's responsibility anyway.
Yeah, YouTube is the place to think. Don't think about search. It's YouTube is the thing to think about. It's a really dangerous part of Google. So.
Are there? I think for obvious reasons, a lot of our conversation has focused on the trails have all led us to digital advertising, but I guess this brings up a related question. Like, outside of the advertising context, how else and for what other purposes is data being collected and used and sold for a non-advertising purpose?
Well, I think the gambling story is a really interesting one, because it's arguably not advertising, but it's targeting the provision of a service to people based on knowledge.
I mean, that's my bigger concern, and it's probably not, you know, it's going to be hard to get into like this iteration, but a lot of data is not even used for purposes of like advertising, but it extends their revenue and it extends their power in their market, right? Where they have more data, which allows them to do more powerful automations, or in some cases, we're literally building or training their algorithms. We are working for them. It's like we're coal mining, and for all the gold that we knock out, it just goes to them, and we don't get paid. They're not. I think part of the conversation needs to be around like we're taxing labor, you know, that they aren't really paying out.
So I think it's a really interesting question where what is and isn't advertising, or is marketing advertising is. So it's been one of my pet peeves forever when it was on TV, and now it's definitely on the internet. these commercials that tell you, oh, you might be suffering from X disease you didn't even know existed, and you must go to your doctor and say, I'm afraid I have X disease, and if I do, I hear there's this really good medicine. So will you prescribe this medicine? And so the research has shown that actually people who watch these TV commercials decide that's me and go ask their doctors for them. The doctors say, yes, I'll write you a prescription for the medicine, even if the doctor later answers the question, I don't think that's a disease. And so, but because it's all programmed in, and so now you have internet with data collection going, ooh, Liz is X age, she has Y disease, which they shouldn't know because it's HIPAA protected, but there's all kinds of ways to find out, you know, because maybe I keep calling up articles about X issue, and so they go, oh, she's that. So now let's convince her she has Y disease because a lot of the symptoms correlate to this other disease we already have decided she has, and then maybe she'll go ask her doctor for it. Is that advertising? It's certainly data mining, and it's certainly trying to get me to go to my doctor and get them to go, ooh, you might have X disease. There was one famous one they came up with a few years ago about when your legs get tingly or something. They created a whole disease for tingling legs. Restless something. But it doesn't actually exist as a disease. But they got a lot of doctors to prescribe some strange medicines for it because, you know, and it is an interesting because it's changing everything.
There's a very entertaining New York Times op-ed, I think it was yesterday, by a New York Times journalist about how weird her Facebook feed is because she's always searching for things in connection with her job, and it's very funny about who Facebook thinks she is now. She's like the lesbian Middle East terrorist with restless leg syndrome.
Well, I mean, there's examples too of like beyond that. I mean, kids that are data is getting used to determine whether they're allowed to go to a certain college or get granted certain education. You have it in the criminal system as well, where you're using data to check to see if a criminal's likely to get put back in prison or in jail. It's more than just advertising, right? And that's what I kind of get back to is like the more we can reduce the dossiers, I think that that's the most like brute force or like basic way to push some of this stuff out in the industry.
Well, then you get into AI algorithms. Senator Hoylman has an algorithm bill.
Right. And I'm working on, even though I said I thought trying to get privacy data privacy bills passed were really hard, I am working on a data privacy bill that grew out of originally all this information we don't want anti-choice red states to get access to so that they track you down and hit you with felonies when you come to New York for reproductive health care services that are legal here. And one of the things we came across early on is there are all these apps, and they're for free for your phone to help women determine their reproductive cycle and their menstrual cycles. And some women track it because they want to try to get pregnant, so this will tell them when the best time to get pregnant is. Some women are tracking for other reasons and patterns within their OB-GYN world. And that companies were buying this data so they could track, gee, you stopped using that, and then you showed up in New York City near a Planned Parenthood on X date. Aha, let's go after you. So there are a million ways this data can be used. I don't know where I'm going with this, other than, again, I think it's like following this rabbit down the hole to try to figure out how you would get all of this into a tax bill.
So my students and I are working on that precise issue in the wake of Dobbs. I think New York would be well served if we had a mechanism to protect female menstrual data, particularly in a right to travel context. I think there is a violation of our right to travel if they are tracking women's menstrual cycles to a state that is supportive of abortion rights. I don't know how that exactly plays out, but there probably is a role for a state that supports privacy and a state that supports the right of women to travel without suspicion and excessive surveillance. to protect that data and not give it back to the state that might have an anti-abortion law?
So we have a bill in draft form, it's not yet, not been introduced, but attempting to do that, and also things like, not allowing geofencing around, healthcare facilities that provide reproductive health care. And based on conversations with Illinois, I've expanded the bill so that you can't get access to my Easy Pass records, because the Midwest states were really, really concerned that people would be driving from Ohio and Indiana to Illinois to get reproductive health care, and their states, who've outlawed everything, would go, aha, why would you be crossing from Ohio to Illinois and going to X town, where Illinois has just opened a new Planned Parenthood center, and we think you're going there for that purpose, and we're gonna get you on the way home and capture you and accuse you of a felony. So we're trying to get all of that into a bill. We're working with Illinois on a parallel model.
So I think the data model plays beautifully.
So you said you have that public?
It's in draft form now, but if you talk to Josh Korn, my legislative director, I'm sure he'd be happy to share draft language.
Yeah,
Because we're interested in making it better.
And so, Liz, on that point,
Yes.
talk about Easy Pass records. And we touched on this a little bit earlier. That is, in theory, even though Easy Pass is not a government entity, that is, you would think, as a ordinary user, that is it's government data, right? Just as your tax returns are government data or your whatever. I think it begs the question whether or not the companies, the data that government entities collect or that they contract with governments to collect or companies to collect on behalf of them, what data protections exist there already, and whether there are any prohibitions on the sale of that data. So I would wonder if in New York State's contract with Easy Pass to administer its toll collection, if we have a prohibition on the sale of
You don't
any
need
data.
to have one.
Well, I wonder how many other contexts of government or government contracted data collection efforts that does or does not exist. And that's
Debt collectors also.
that's a small, again, that's probably a small slice of what we're talking about here. But if we're trying to, clear out some of the underbrush and figure out where we can insert some protections, that would be an obvious place to start, I think, on the sale of that.
DMV earns a lot of money selling those data. But because of the Federal Driver's Privacy Protection Act, it's very difficult for journalists to get any kind of driver data. And Easy Pass records, I believe, are totally exempt from the Freedom of Information Law.
Who does DMV
Who do they sell their data
to?
Lots of companies, insurance companies.
I mean, but like the period tracking apps, they're outside of the scope of HIPAA, which is how they're able to do what they want with that
Right.
type of data.
Right.
I used to live in Texas, and there was this story about people being turned away at the border because of these period tracking apps. And in addition to that, it's not just necessarily people's geolocation, but just search history and DMs on Facebook. People in other states where abortion's been banned with these knee-jerk laws, their private messages on Facebook were handed over, and the mother of a teenager seeking abortion was arrested because they were having a conversation on Facebook Messenger. People's Google searches for abortion clinics in other states has led to them having legal trouble. So it's not really necessarily just their location, but also just their digital footprint in general, and that's not something that there's a lot of protection for right now. But that also could fall into the scope of this work.
But again, I think it's too big a set of assignments to try to put in one of these bills or a merged version of these bills. But I do think this is really
Next meeting.
very important, and the hypotheticals right now that we're hearing from all these states is pretty terrifying.
And journalists also don't understand the use cases to provide oversight either.
Right.
I do think it might be useful as a separate measure from any of the revenue measures to look at the sale of information about somebody's location. Instead of just restricting it to geofencing, like clinics, and I think it should not be possible for the phone companies to sell all this information about where we are minute by minute.
Well, that would close down a whole bunch of these apps, right? Those weird apps where your friends can look and see where you were,
Find my
and then
Find my friends.
Right.
and I've always thought it was like a little weird, but like something younger people did. But you're right. I mean, the potential to use that for disturbing things is pretty scary.
But the new iPhone, I think, has something that automatically calls 911 if it thinks you've been in a car crash.
Yes. Or if
the
you
iPhone
fall in,
Watch
if you
does.
fall.
I think some of the cars, some of the newer cars have something like that too, crash detection, and it will automatically call for help.
So we actually had one of those happen in Nebraska. It was, I'd never seen anything like it. When I found out, it was like, well, it's kind of good in one sense, right? Because then you're alerted to something you might not be alerted about for a long time. It's also terrifying because that just means it's always on. So it's there. You can't turn it off.
And yet, I don't think we're putting it in either of our bills.
No.
Yeah,
No.
Not today.
Well, I think there's also been some recognition that, we're not trying to shut down the data economy. Like, we understand that the world today operates on zeros and ones.
Speak for yourself.
Broad, generally speaking, right? Like, we're not trying to remove data. It becomes so integral to the functioning of everything, whether it's commercialized or not, right? I think it's trying to figure out where there is excess and where there is, there's like legitimate uses of data, and for public good, necessity, etc., versus commercialized uses, profit-making enterprises, with protections, lack of protections, either or. There's a distinction to be made there, right? Which I think is what we've been trying to get at overall with this whole conversation, which is how do we bring this conversation back to supporting public benefit, public good, and how do we reinvest some of these profits back into our own local economy, whether it's city, state, etc. Because it's clear that we're not capturing it, and even just by this conversation, there are so many pieces of this that data touches all of it, and we're not capturing any of it at all, which is I think we agree is problematic. I wonder if, kind of trying to refocus us a little bit, we've talked a little bit about, how we can potentially structure a tax. We've talked a little bit about the best way to calculate, revenue versus users. We touched briefly on, I want to return to this, like where we think in this chain or chains is the most place, does it make the most sense to kind of place some type of recapture, I guess is the way I'll describe it right now. Is it at the collection stage? Is it at the intermediary stage? Is it at the final stage? I think if we're talking about advertising, there might be one answer. If we're talking about a different thing, it might be a different answer. But I think it might help us to think more sharply about where we're at if we can spend a few minutes thinking about where in these different chains might make the most sense. And that might also help us sharpen some of our understanding as to the universes that we're talking about here.
Well, I could say that there's some language in the Kruger bill that's a little misleading because it kind of talks about, first it lists a bunch of things you can do. You can sell, you can this, you can that, But then the second part of the definition is you have to collect from over a million people. So really the definition is collection is what it's focused on. And it's over a million per month. And that's the trigger. Now, again, you can collect from the consumer him or herself, but it also does apply to secondary collection. So if Google sold their information to somebody else, that person is now collecting. If they collect over a million per month, then they have to pay the tax. And I don't know how many rounds it can go around, but we didn't focus on sale or the action of selling. It's not about revenue. It kicks in just on the basis of collecting the data, and there are some benefits to that. Among them that it captures the value of data in and of itself, whether or not that's monetized. And that's, they have a lot of wealth because they have a lot of data, and we at least capture some of that on its way in, as opposed to on its, until it's monetized.
I do think the intake valve is a great place because that's where you can just kind of do like bulk levels versus like if you try to go to the exits there, you got to get into the different industries, you got to get into different use cases. It's just going to be a big rabbit hole for a long time.
And in the, Rob, as you were describing it, the collection, and you kind of define collection as at any transfer point is a new collection, right? You said. basically. So
if they're using it for to sell, I mean, if you hire a company to analyze your data or to store your data, that would not trigger liability for the company that's analyzing the data
Sure.
or storing the data. So yes, but if there's a transfer of sales to somebody who's going to use it for commercial purposes to sell advertising, or it's broader than that. If they're collecting data from customers, then they have the right to do with it what they want, then that would be subject to.
and is that any conveyance aside from the non-commercialized purpose? So for example, one of the things that we learned in our research was oftentimes companies, they won't outright sell data, they will transfer it to a subsidiary that does that job, or they will in-kind it, or it might be like BART. So there'll be non-pecuniary transferences of this data that's not necessarily commercial in nature, and it's not an outright sale. But they will either internally to a different subsidiary or to another third party transfer or lease or rent out the list or whatever. Do all of those kind of count as the collection in that case?
Yeah, I think we'd want to be careful not to engage in a lot of layer taxation of the same. So if a company, for no consideration, gives it down to their subsidiary, I don't think we'd want to be capturing it. On the other hand, being able to use the data but not owning it, I think would be if the person acquiring the data was going to use it, even though they didn't own it, and they would be capturing it from more than 1 million customers, they would be in.
So, right, and I guess I hear you on the double taxation point. I wonder if there's any ability then for a company to avoid, if they just convey it to someone else, and then that person conveys it to, if that's like an intentional third, intermediary conveyance for the purpose of avoiding a tax in that chain, and then that person conveys it out, like, because oftentimes, Google will then give their data to their, Google ad company, that's or whatever entity. Do we break the chain at that point, I guess is the question, and is that a problem for us to be thinking about?
Here's another way to think about it. Facebook gives away software libraries, gets firms to use it, helps solve things like tracking. But then Facebook will then collect back the information that it uses for the advertising. With Facebook, the firm that uses those libraries, they just get them for free. They don't probably have to do anything under your bill. Would Facebook have to show that it's getting information by giving away these free software libraries for other sites to use?
I don't think that would work that way. I mean, they're doing a head count of Facebook of how many people are they capturing information about.
It doesn't really go into what they don't do with the data.
And I guess
But
if
site A is using free Facebook libraries, site A may have a bunch of users, but site A isn't knowingly doing anything with information. But Facebook is collecting all the information on all of its users.
So Facebook will have to pay anyway, and the other site, if they've got over 1 million users in New York, is that what we're saying?
I mean, I'm not sure how you're saying they're using the information, but these data libraries do something with the information. It has to be for profit. But I think there's that language.
Often what Facebook does is they give you free libraries that help you do something that you want as a business, like analytics. But then what they get is the information about their users.
Well, if they're just transferring analytics, but not
And they're not,
customer
there's no
information.
payment. There's no payment.
Right,
And
but
I
what
would
about
think it's
customer?
the two businesses, Facebook's gonna have to pay anyway, and then if the business using the data they got from Facebook libraries, I'm not sure what that means, then has 1 million subscribers from New York, or just users, then they get hit with it anyway.
If you're suggesting what they're giving them is like analytic tools and not the names of consumers, then the analytic tools is not subject to, it's a head count of consumers.
But I guess what the senator's saying is that if Facebook is basically getting head count by giving free to libraries software, just free software to firms. The firms use it with their users. You want to make sure that those count as head count where Facebook
for
is getting
Facebook,
information
yes.
about them.
Yes, that's right.
I would just also throw in for anything where we think about going forward from the lessons I'm hearing today. One, try to be as simple as possible. And two, listen to the outline of the risks of litigation and try to minimize the number of things that can hit us with lawsuits.
Right. Which will happen anyway. But yeah, I
Well,
agree.
yes, but if we can
Minimize.
minimize,
Yeah.
minimizing lawsuits would be good.
Senator Kruger, to your point about being simple, I think if we have an example for a category that might also help us. So if I'm buying a car, the different data points which are valuable about me as a prospective car buyer, there's intender data because I did a search and said, good deal, what top rated pickup truck. There's demographic data, right? Do I have kids? Do I own a farm? Do I, what's my age? There's psychographic data. So what do I look for in a vehicle? Do I want something? Do I care that it's American made? Do I want one that makes me look good? So there are these different types of data that are all potentially relevant to my desire to buy a vehicle. And the way that Ford would use that data versus an auto insurance company would use that data versus the way that my local dealership would use that data. Right. They're all buying the same types of data to be able to recognize me as a prospective buyer, but we may consider some of those forms of data or some of those use cases to be more or less legitimate or kind of creating a value as opposed to exploitative of value, if that makes sense. Right? Because the degree in which Ford, maybe I'm already a Ford buyer, maybe they already know who I am, what it means for them to say, hey, your lease is almost up, we know that, would you like to buy a new Ford again? As opposed to if I'm a Chevy owner and how different that relationship is when Ford targets me.
Again, I'm hoping not to have to delve into any of those questions in order to tax this model of information.
Yeah, I would say that there's no judgment call about the good exploitive versus non-exploitive. All those, if you're gathering data, whether you're already a Ford owner or you're a Chevy owner, and it can be one little piece of data too because it's head count, so it could be a little, you could say it's on where somebody's collecting a lot, but if they're only interested in one piece of data about one part of this consumer profile. You're collecting data about that person. They get included in the head count if you're over 1 million.
I want to pivot a little bit. One of the areas where Senator Kruger and my bills differ a little bit is in the tax structure, graduated versus a flat tax, and we'd love to hear some thoughts and comments from the group on that distinction. If there are identifiable pros or cons that folks might be willing to share some thoughts on.
I have one piece of advice that it could raise the level of court challenge, but might also just be a political challenge. If you design a bill so that you say if you don't pay any tax, if you make say less than $1,000, but you pay 10% tax if you make more than $1,000. If just the person makes one additional dollar and going from $999 to $1,000 gets pays a huge tax on that $1. So I wouldn't build in that kind of rate structure. But instead, you can just have one that mimics like the federal tax. So you have an interval, and you have a tax rate on income in that interval, and then you have a tax rate on income above that. It might generate a little bit less, revenue if you don't apply the higher tax to the very first bracket, but it will just protect you from these huge jumps.
It's cliffs and brackets, yes.
Right. So the 49.59. So it's $1 million. Under $1 million don't pay anything, but everybody's got more than $1 million. There's a zero rate on the first $1 million,
exactly,
and then a higher rate as you go on.
I speaking for my bill, we can certainly adjust to avoid that problem.
Yeah, but I think we've got it under control.
I was thinking a little bit more about my example. One thing I'd look at really carefully is to make sure that Facebook's head count doesn't just apply to, say, the people who come to the Facebook site, but if Facebook is collecting information because it's got these pixels on everybody else's website, it's got these likes. So you want to say Facebook's head count is, or anybody's head count is people who come to their site or the people that they collect information about because of other places they go.
That's important.
Is it easy? Can we capture that universe? Is that easily?
Well,
can we like network that map somehow from a
I think the thing that the Facebook might say is, look, we know that somebody went to like this site because we have a like button on it, and so we know somebody went there. We know somebody went here. We don't know if those are the same people or not. So how do we know that how many distinct head count we have? I think the truth is Facebook, in fact, gets lots of information about all those different people. So they generally know if it's the same person or not, but they might claim they don't.
I'd be interested to see how it plays into like conversations around bots too, though, because they probably have dossiers on bots they don't even realize are bots. Like they can't sort out all the users as real or robot at this point. You don't have the internet anymore. It's bots. So that's the other thing that I get concerned about with headcount measures. It's like, how do you validate it? Number one, because they're known to lie. Number two, how do they actually know? Because they don't, in full. You probably could take off 40 to 60% of any claims they make.
How do they handle that in terms of giving out the statistical data on unique monthly visitors? I mean, it says, advertisers presumably wouldn't want to pay if they get bots.
I don't know if they do.
The monthly visitors numbers are typically people who go, say, to the Facebook site. But Facebook has these likes and pixels on
you can embed
almost
the widget
every
on any page, and you can access Facebook through that way.
Yeah, and there's I actually have a recording of it because I've been tracking a lot more that I run into now. And there was one from Wired magazine, Condé Nast, the parent company, and in it says that it can leverage data from outside sources. Like GDPR, you're supposed to do only what your business needs at the most basic level to operate. And one of theirs that they require is that they can combine offline data from other sources as part of their operations. And I said, how does that require publication? I don't necessarily agree. But then what they also have, what that allows them to do is track devices too. So they can see, today I'm on my phone, tomorrow I'm on my tablet, the day after I'm on my laptop, and that is all the same person. They're one unique viewer, but we've had 3 different hits to my website, right?
I think you could say something like it's the number of distinct individuals that they get information on either directly or indirectly, and just put the bonus on them to come up with how many distinct people is that.
It may actually create a really great conversation with Wall Street, who wants to know these numbers,
Yeah.
They want to know what's actually happening, because we're seeing the stocks tank right now, and it's partly because the curtain is coming down a bit. It's not actually that they're bad companies, it's that we're realizing maybe they're not as valuable as we thought.
It's very relevant to the Twitter conversation and how many Twitter accounts are real or not, and Elon Musk's crusade to figure out who are the real Twitter users, right? And I guess in some ways, to your point, this actually might be an incentive for the companies to clean house and lower their user numbers, because they don't want to get charged for the bots that are out there.
Because New York State could say those are different people unless you can prove to us otherwise.
Right.
You will have arguments about anonymity on a platform, right? People will say, hey, especially human rights organizations will say, hey, by requiring this, they're going to push companies to validate users more and more, and that could cause some identification issues in terms of people not being able to be anonymous online. There would be arguments like that. But I do think
it's an issue with Twitter in Iran and people who are at risk.
But again, I mean, these companies know so much. No one is anonymous in the United States right now.
So Michael, do you have any perspective on the original question of I guess you're not a chair here, you're whatever you are, a senator.
I'm just Andrew. Yeah, I guess we're thinking about the graduated versus flat approach.
I think if the concern is, and it's a legitimate concern, that some of these companies have gotten so huge and so powerful, that you want to impose a tax that is going to counteract that, then I think you want on a graduated tax. I mean, normally, when we think about a graduated tax in other contexts, we're thinking something about what the ultimate incidence of the tax is, and the ability to pay on the assumption that the tax is going to fall on the person that it's initially levied on. That really isn't the concern here. The concern, here is just the size of the company, regardless of what the ultimate incidence of the tax is. So I think it's totally, if we're concerned about how big and how powerful these companies have become, and we're trying to do something to counteract that, then I think it argues for graduated.
So, who else? I mean, we've talked a little bit about concerns for media companies. Our bill talks a little bit about startups. Are there any other? Being careful we don't open up a rabbit hole or Pandora's box. Like, what other users of this data do we think we should be considering for either limited liability or an exemption outright? Are there other uses that are worth us considering?
I think political ads are not big dollar items, but they're important in terms of how the whole system works. So politicians want to target ads just like firms want to target ads.
Could we require honesty in advertising?
Well, I do think you could require disclosure. I think you could require a lot more disclosure about what political ads are.
State law actually even has a disclosure requirement for internet or independent expenditure committees. That those requirements fall on online platforms. They're supposed to publish a database of ads and rates.
Yeah, political advertising, that's not commercial use under the not-for-profit organizations. I think unions maybe are left out and some other things. So political ads would not, the Democratic Campaign Committee or something, they're not.
If they're collecting information you wouldn't have.
Right.
So
They're
I
great. I'm sorry.
I just know in the world of COVID and flu and everything, so both our city, our state, and lots of individual hospital systems have been sending out messaging to various people, reminding them it's time to get the booster. If you're above a certain age, it's time to make sure you get that flu vaccine. I don't think I would want to really define that as commercial public health.
Well,
I think it depends how it gets used.
Well, certainly they want to bring you into their facility if they're a hospital. I get that, as opposed to just make sure you get health care.
Yeah.
But I also wouldn't want to discourage them from sharing information via internet about smart public health policy.
Well, you want to say like 2-for-1 deal on your vaccines at John Smith Hospital, right? That I think I would be concerned about. But if it's just like flu season's
Public
here, get your
service
flu shot.
I think the way the bill is written, it might turn on whether it's a not-for-profit hospital or a for-profit hospital, which you might not want. That may not be a good policy way to do it, but I think that's the way it would come down.
Well, in New York and all of our hospitals are not-for-profit,
Not-for-profit,
even as they make massive profits.
Exactly.
Um,
That's another
that's
issue.
another issue.
What makes
Another
you a
issue.
not-for-profit in New York?
What about
separate
food
issue
co-ops
altogether.
as opposed to grocery stores?
Hmm?
What about food co-ops as opposed to grocery stores?
Yeah.
Credit unions.
Yeah, we have to look at their tax status. Probably the federal tax status would tell us if they pay corporate tax in New York. There's some precedent.
What
there.
about an S-corp?
Not many of those
They're
are going to
socially
be
conscious.
collecting. Not many of those are going to be collectors of data, but there might be somebody who collects data for sale to like a political party, and then you got to decide, can they claim some kind of exemption if they're selling it?
No, it doesn't matter who you sell.
Well, I think some of this is one of the reasons why we were looking at incidental use of data that's not commercial in nature. We want to protect that type of behavior. We want to almost encourage that in some ways, like in the PSA context, right? We don't want to say that is an economic activity that we're trying to tax or regulate. It's really the commercialization of the data that is the driver of this. And maybe that's a way we can kind of put more color to that distinction and try to add more definition there in terms of how we separate the two. right? So going back to my bank example, I'm fine with my bank collecting my birthday and my social security number to access my account, but if they're then using that data to sell me more financial products or sell me third-party affiliates, then the value created by that transference, I think, is the type of activity we want to go after, as opposed to the let Andrew see, what's in his bank account.
But what you need to look at in the not-for-profit context is if you make a distinction between a not-for-profit news organization and a for-profit news organization.
I think some of the questions you're talking about would we could answer them if we had very detailed disclosure of what all the ads are that these firms are selling. And so one thing you might think about is just a mandate that these firms say, like anybody who's involved in using data to display advertising to residents of New York, that the firms be required to disclose what those ads were and what were the characteristics of the groups that each particular ad was targeted at.
So that makes a lot of sense. I have to believe, or I want to believe, that some level of that is already. There's got to be some level of disclosure already happening. I just know in the context, in the political context, when we're buying political ads, and I talk to my folks who buy digital ads for me during campaign season, they can tell like when other people are. There's like a way of on the back end somehow being able to tell who's spending money against me, what the entity is, and like where it's coming from. We can kind of track, not in great detail, but we have a rough sense of it, and especially in the Facebook context, that I think Facebook does provide for political ads a lot of detail in terms of dollars spent and who's behind it and what the owner of the account is. But I think even in the non-Facebook context, there's a little bit.
Yeah, they do it voluntarily, and it was partly to preempt federal disclosure requirement. Okay. But they also decide internally what's a political ad and what's not, and so you're seeing the whole picture.
So in the industry, there's a contractual document, the insertion order, which is basically an agreement between the advertiser and then whether it's the publisher of the network. But then there's a human that's usually often in the loop between the I/O and the actual configuration of the data elements that are being used in a campaign. So here, it's just important to figure out how to bridge that gap of here's what we're buying versus the way in which it was executed, because the person doing the investment may actually have quite a bit of latitude on what data they use and from what provider. So I, as Ford, just said, hey, I want to find prospective buyers of pickup trucks, but the actual investment person at the DSP console said, well, I'm going to use a little bit of this, and a little bit of this, and a little bit of this to see what worked best. Would be a very common practice. So even to just figuring out what the intent was on behalf of Ford versus what was actually targeted is a bit of a knowledge gap for some systems.
You could still require that information be retained. What were the characteristics you used to target specific groups?
Yeah, that would be in each DSP console.
I think also though you could use the initial entries, but if it is any kind of machine learning system, you may struggle over time to fully understand what it's learning or what it's using as its levers.
For any kind of lookalike or intended model.
But I do think you can definitely document the
But just record who was it displayed to.
In many cases, in part because of third-party cookie deprecation, it's not actually known. You don't actually know who or whether that person was a human.
Well, what were the characteristics you used to select that?
Yes, but exactly to Joe's point, you're not actually always aware if it's algorithmically targeted. You wouldn't know what attributes were available to the model.
You can definitely you can document like the initial entries, like what was your intent, what data point did you initiate to start the thinking, and then like the problem, and I just think this is a huge problem with the industry, but like, and I guess it talks a little bit about algorithm modeling, but like, we don't really know right now, at least, how those things develop, and that's the problem.
But again, I mean, they know locations, they know IP addresses, they know it wouldn't be very hard to see who's getting.
I think if you were very specific in the use case.
It's just important to talk about who is they, because it may be visible, for example, to the DSP, but it's not visible to the advertiser. And
if somebody is looking at it, it could be mandated as part of the information that's gotta be disclosed.
It's just a question of who's paying the tax, right, and whether the person paying the tax has access to that information.
But again, the disclosure requirement could be independent of the.
Although we also have to be careful the disclosure requirement doesn't translate into just billions of pieces of information that come to somebody at the state, like we're gonna do something
Well,
with it,
but-
because I'm not really clear that we are.
But here, people like independent researchers and academics might actually be like your friends, because as you build up all this data, we start to know a lot more about what.
I could say that intent would, the tax department would not be happy to hear that they had to judge intent.
Yeah.
So, that's true.
I don't see them
That's-
feeling like they're in that business. So, not that we don't require things all the time that don't happen in state government,
Right,
right?
right. I know Paul has to leave. We've kind of gone through a lot of our discussion questions. Are there any other points that we have not raised that folks think are relevant to kind of the mechanics here?
I have one question about your bill.
Oh, yeah.
Was there something in your bill that it's the one
Thank you, Paul.
tax? Thank you so much. And then, but it also can trigger a different additional 2% gross receipt tax? Or is it the only tax is the?
So the tax
2%
is,
gross
it's 2% of gross receipts, receipts or revenue? I think it's net is it gross? Yeah, gross receipts divided by number of New York users. So we're trying to identify how much of their income, or their revenue, is derived from New York users, and then it's 2% of that revenue amount.
But there's not an additional tax.
Not
That's
additional
that's
tax.
the only tax.
That's the only tax, yeah.
So my concern, I guess, was that, so you're gonna have to make decisions about, whether it's incidental or whether there's a commercial purpose or not, and the organization that's gonna do that is the new entity.
Correct.
And when the new entity makes that decision, that's gonna make the decision about the tax status, I think. Right, because if you are determined to have to comply with the regulation, the way the bill's written, then you're gonna be a taxpayer. So I think you might see a lot more action at the, with this new agency when people have tax liability on the line than whether it's just a regular, oh, I'm gonna have to fill out some information. So you might expect,
Challenges.
a lot
That's a
of
fair point.
challenges.
So the reason we had designed it that way, to put it in the Office of Consumer Data Protection, is to kind of build onto what Senator Thomas's bill had proposed in the Privacy Act, which also creates a separate, state Office of Data Privacy. And so rather than having, too many different entities or agencies, we wanted to kind of craft ours based loosely on that framework so that we could append this piece of it onto whatever ends up happening on the privacy side, so that one state agency would be responsible for issuing the data regulations and privacy regulations and making these distinctions. But I think it's a fair question about how do you then, what the connection from that point to DTF is, and then where the challenges may lie. I think that's a very fair point for us to think about. Michael, you have a point you want to raise? Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry. I have a question about the language of the bill. So the tax, the tax applies to data controllers with New York, New York, about whom there's New York data. And so the definition of data controller says this includes, but is not limited to, any business website or platform that collects data while selling electronic advertising space on its platform. So my question is whether in choosing that language you contemplated potential challenges under the Internet Tax Freedom Act, given the reference to, quote unquote, electronic advertising space on its platform, and whether you had notions that there would be non-internet based advertisers that nonetheless could be characterized as providing like non-internet electronic advertising space on a platform so that you have a plausible claim that you're not limiting this tax to just internet advertising.
We did not contemplate that, but I like where you're going.
You can also ask our
I
in-house
think that's
resident
great.
legal expert that helped us consider these legal questions, Jonathan and his team. I think Becky's right. We didn't
didn't draft it
contemplate
that
that
way.
distinction
Yeah.
when we initially drafted that, but I think it's a very fair question for us to think about.
Yeah, I think you might have,
Yeah.
included, you're pretty inclusive in your definition of who's, so like, let's use the credit card company
Yeah.
again. If they're collecting data, not from the internet, but, your bill, and you
Right,
pay your
right.
bill, then I didn't see why they would not be included in your bill, which helps you with your, an attack from them. Right.
I don't remember if we talked about that point.
I think there's a really interesting distinction there between what a credit card company is and what a third-party exploiter of data is. We always talk about. Do you all know about the third-party doctrine? That's a doctrine that allows government essentially to avoid the Fourth Amendment because you, as an end user, have agreed to give your data over to a third party, either Facebook or Google. They do not have to follow proper Fourth Amendment procedure to get your data if you've already relinquished control to Facebook or Google. That's whether that or not that's legitimate or not. A credit card company is not a third-party intermediary. If you're using a credit card company as an intermediary between yourself and Facebook or yourself and Amazon, they're a second party. I think they should have heightened obligations to protect your data. I think there should be something that says they cannot exploit your data the same way. And if they do, then they are subject to breaches of their fiduciary duty to you as a second party, trusted second party that holds your sacred data. Separate and apart from any of the internet companies. That may be another bill.
But when I open a credit card, especially like a loyalty card with like affinity points for an airline or a gas card, there's absolutely language that's the part of that affinity relationship is the sharing of information with one or more partners or prospective partners.
So to the extent you've licensed away the right in that particular circumstance, I guess that's true. But if you were to buy something from Amazon, the government shouldn't be able to go to your credit card company and get your payment information. You can go to Amazon and get your payment information, but not for you. Because if you had gone to Amazon and paid them cash, there would have been no intermediary there that can go ask the retailer, the end vendor, who could ask your money. But that may be a completely stray, separate issue.
Yeah.
Here's what it comes down to, from my perspective, and I don't want to go, lead us down all these other paths because I do think there is important work to be done on the data tax front. But I think ultimately, New York needs to champion the concept that data belongs to the user, and that's where the value resides. And New York can say, data belongs to the user. There are circumstances in which the user has to give its data over to someone to function in a modern society. We as New York State are going to protect that data and make sure that as much value goes back to the end user as possible. Be it the state as a protector of the user or the state as a trusted intermediary, what have you. That's, I think, whatever bill you do should, I think, arguably be framed in those terms. Data belongs to our residents and we will do everything in our power to protect our residents and the value to our residents.
If I can ask a question, we've used a number of different terms. I think they mean different things, right? There's a user, there's a consumer, there's a resident, there's a citizen. And I think especially the degree to which it influences reporting requirements, it's a really important distinction. Because I might know that I delivered an ad to a device in New York, but that device could be your iPad, your phone, your computer. I don't know that they're the same person. I don't know that you're a New York citizen versus maybe I know you're a resident if there's an address that's linked to that device. But just so we're being very conscious of what the reporting expectation is for the term that we use.
Or you're just passing through to a European resident.
Sure. Yeah, but I still pay New York sales tax if I'm a New Jersey resident, right?
I think another challenging point of conversation that will have to come up is at some point too, there's a lot of businesses, multiple routes. One that, more traditional is easy to wrap your head around, but like companies that built their whole platform off Shopify or Magento or something where like they didn't build the custom code. They don't actually per se like process or control the data. It is Shopify or other plugins they've used. So that's one route that makes it really hard to allocate liability, I think. And then the other is all this no-code movement is now coming up, where it's new platforms that are making it easier for everybody to code or program or build apps. And again, it's third-party infrastructure you're using. The data flows all through them. And who's responsible at the end of the day is a hard question.
So related to that, I think it's a Jonathan and Michael question because now they completely confuse me. So I know that my credit card companies know something about my economic value and worth because they make you tell them if you want a certain credit limit, right? I don't know that Amazon is supposed to know what my income level or my assets are. But they do.
They can impute it from your data.
So, because I just learned, and it was so disturbing to me, this nice young man who's dating my niece. I'm driving them home from a party, and I say, "What do you do?" And he goes, "I work for Amazon." I go, "Oh, everyone works for Amazon." And he says, "Yes." I go, "So what do you do?" And he goes, "I'm in charge of a group that targets people to get them to buy our products, and it's based on their having a net worth or income of $20,000 and under after taxes, and my job is to get them to spend $2,000 or 10% of their net income on Amazon products."
That's horrible.
And I said, "How do you know they only have $20,000 in net income?" He goes, "Well, that's not my job. They give me the info."
Oh my god.
And I'm like, "And you're supposed to get 10% of their income?" He goes, "That's my job." And I actually said out loud, "That's a terrible job. Get a different job. You're a nice young man who's dating my family member." But isn't that weird? I mean, so based on what you were saying and what you were saying about third party, how come they have that info and can use it that way? Just because they can?
There's nothing to stop it.
Well, they have a customer relationship with you, and they have the permission to take your email address,
Yeah.
send it out to a data broker, and get additional data appended to it. Right. So Axiom will happily give you income brackets, and this would be the case for thousands of organizations, and append any number of different demographic attributes from whether you own a home to your income, rough investable assets, any like lifestyle affinity data. That's a very common type of append for any type of commerce company that wants to know what to target to next.
So they probably do know whether I live in New York or not.
You having packages shipped there?
What?
You having packages shipped to New York?
So here's this is an important distinction of the data broker certainly knows.
Yeah.
The commerce company that you have a relationship with certainly knows. The issue is more the third-party advertising companies that Jonathan's referenced, that they're delivering an ad to you based on a model that says how likely is it that you're looking for a vacation or looking to buy a car. So it's more of an issue for those that live in the anonymous advertising space. They don't know. And it's not like cost effective for them to know either. If that helps.
Okay. But the more you know, the more you're concerned you are.
My question is, wouldn't Amazon still have the right to do that in aspect? I think I was listening to what Rob was saying, that from its transfer within the same entity of the data, there wouldn't be like legally doing anything that's like wrong in that
Yeah, I
sense.
don't think we're stopping them from doing anything. I was just trying to get an understanding of how all this information flowed or didn't.
But I feel like from once it stays within the same entity, that company, they can do so.
Well, that's what Google does best, right? They stand up a bunch of digital projects to get a bunch of different types of data, and then they can aggregate it within their organization, first party, rather than having to rely on third party.
So
That's
it's
literally
they don't need a third party because they can do so.
That's why
with their
Google has
organization.
the right?
Although Google is supposed to separate out what one division does separate from another,
Yeah.
They're not supposed to integrate the data across.
No, Not supposed to.
The keyword that's
Then they just settled some big 40 state lawsuit about how they misused Google Map data and like shared it inappropriately.
Yeah, it's not costing them enough. It's a
Right.
speed bump.
Right.
You know, really.
So
Make more money.
So I guess then, you know, we can talk then briefly, the non-compliant, assuming we can figure out all of the challenges we just laid out here, what is an appropriate speed bump? Like what is a way to catch folks who are trying to evade or circumvent or get around whatever we design here? What's an effective kind of sanction?
Well, I think that
Like how much is enough, or how much is not enough? How much is too much? Like what's the?
I hear you. I mean, like I think the GDPR created a good conversation about that because people are moving in Europe. I think 4%, right, or 2% depending on the kind of activities. It's causing a conversation. I don't know what that higher level of like this is too much would be. I suspect as soon as you get closer to like a 10% level, there's really going to be some big arguments. But I think 4 to 6, maybe even up to 8%, you could really have a conversation about. And perhaps there's different ranges based on risk of the data too, like whether it's biometric or certain classic. I don't know if that's another thing to think about. Because you kind of think of it like a hazardous material at some point, right? Like some obviously it's all, the greater risk is within the context of the engagement, but also there is some information that by default is just higher risk.
Any other thought on that?
See, I think ultimately that walks into the politics side of our lives,
Sure.
where we say X, and then somebody like a governor says, no, not at that level. That's way too high, and then you negotiate down.
Right.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But like understanding like just if $350 million is a slap on the wrist, and that can pay for a lot of things in our world, right? Like, but like if that's not enough, and that gets to the point. This is not just about making money. This is about like smart, thoughtful regulation, and reclaiming sufficient value. That's not enough, right? So like where.
Well, and I don't also like. I think this shouldn't be put into place with the assumption we're going to stop everything.
Right.
But if you can make a stop sign that reduces 60 or 80% of the, you know, the problems, then you've achieved a lot. Made a big step in the world. You know. So I would start there with that mindset, right? Like you're not going to be perfect on the first swipe. But you can always work on it. You're right. You need money to operate.
Yeah. We always want money. Always want money. So we
No,
can.
we don't say that. We need money. It's not that we want it. We need it.
We want to provide for a CUNY system that's fully funded, right?
Correct.
We need to provide a CUNY system that's fully funded. So as we're kind of hitting our time here, it's just a little after 2:30. We've covered, I think, almost all the questions that we had outlined originally in our discussion points. We picked up some other things as well. Any last thoughts? I'll start with you, Senator Kruger, if you want to. Any lessons learned or last thoughts that we should be taking away from this conversation? Or obviously recognizing that, we hope that this is not the last conversation we have on this.
I really enjoyed the event. I learned a lot. I learned more about what I don't know out there in this field and need to think more of. But I do think for the specific discussion of these 3 bills we were looking at today, I think that there are a lot of commonalities that there's general agreement on as we move forward. And so I look forward to continuing to work with you on coming up with a model that we think, you know, mostly hits all the right buttons and can be done in the state of New York.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Throw it open.
Oh, thank you for putting this together. I mean, I think it's been a great conversation. We had a lot of good people in the room to talk about this. I'm sure we'll get a lot of feedback from industry once they have the opportunity. But I also want to say thank you for doing it. I think it's very important what you're doing. Whether it succeeds today or 5 years down the road, it's good that we're having this now. So thank you. And let us know how we can help. You know.
Have you assembled all the draft bills in the other states besides Maryland? Do you know who's doing what? Who are your allies in the other states?
We did
other nations. Do you know of any other bills yet?
I think I only know maybe 2 states that contacted me be about Senator Kruger's bill. There was one that was submitted in Utah, I think, and then Massachusetts, the other state that contacted me, but I don't know whether they actually submitted a bill. But it hasn't. It's been a topic of conversation, but I think the finances of the states will have to get worse before there's a lot of activity. It's not something you're going to do if you don't need the revenue, and so far they haven't. I think we're a year or two away, and then I think you'll see a lot of.
To the extent that you're more uniform with at least one other state, I think you get a lot of headway with the federal
Sure.
system as well. We don't want to see a patchwork of stuff. So to the extent you're working with, what's it called,
CSL. And CSL?
Uniform Law Commission.
Okay.
To the extent you can develop something that would fly with the Universal Law Commission, and then you can be the template for other states, then you've done good in New York, and you've created a model that could be rolled out in other states. And then you've got uniformity, and the feds can't say, or people can't argue with the feds, we've got this patchwork of statutes that don't make any sense to us.
So on this, not that we want to open up a whole other discussion point, but I was remiss for not mentioning this earlier. One of the legal flags that we had run into after we kind of went down this road a little bit, which I think is fairly new, which I think answers your question about other jurisdictions, was the G20 agreement on a global minimum corporate tax, which a large part of that conversation was about how do you tax digital companies and digital entities in all these different jurisdictions. And a lot of our research had showed that different European countries were interested in this topic, but that seems to have waned in light of that agreement, which the U.S. is a party to, but we have not implemented yet. And so I think there's a question as to whether or not there is any international or federal preemption on those grounds, even though the details of all that are still very murky and not complete yet, which is something for us to keep thinking about as we move forward. And I see Michael has his hand raised as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess I can make just some concluding observations. I mean, I think the first one I'd make is, which I've emphasized all along, is that I think in all of this discussion of this issue in general, ultimately the Internet Tax Freedom Act is kind of the limiting factor. So I think you anything you think about here, you have to sort of have that in mind and think about how you can structure these taxes to minimize the risk. Because as I said, I think the constitutional issues are easy to deal with. The if issues are really challenging. The second observation I make is that you kind of need to think about what your real goal here is, and we all know that this industry and these industries are like doing really bad stuff with a lot of this data. We have all kinds of legitimate concerns about that, but I think your ability to influence that very much with the tax system is really minimal. I mean, the notion that we could that any feasible tax that a state could enact would actually disincentivize 60 or 80% of this is really unrealistic. These are hugely profitable companies, and I mean, I think if you could enact a tax that would disincentivize 5% of this, that would be a huge compliment. I mean, I think the basic goal of taxing this is to just raise some revenue that will allow the state to, local governments deal with the real externalities that they themselves are paying for. I mean, think about how much it's costing state and local governments, all the anti-vax information that's been spread over the last 3 years, and just think about the cost that inadequate vaccination of people is imposing on state and local governments. I mean, if you could just have a tax that would at least allow you to recoup some revenue to address that kind of cost. I mean, think about now all the state and local governments that are having to provide extra police protection to people working on elections. So I think if you just recoup enough revenue to help you pay for some of those externalities, that in of itself would be a big thing. Not to mention what I discussed at the beginning. beginning about like trying to recapture some of the revenue that you lost from the shift of things that you previously taxed, like GPS service subscriptions to things that you can't tax anymore because they're being provided for free. And so, I mean, in terms of the issue, I think ultimately, I mean, because Senator Kruger's bill taxes all data, whether it's gathered on the internet or whether it takes the form of, it's embodied in internet advertising or not, I think it's more likely to sustain a challenge under it than the other two bills that were under discussion today. I think alternative to that, I mean, I think you can tax digital advertising. I think you can tax digital advertising without running afoul of ITFA, but you either have to come up with a really good definition of targeted advertising as Professor Romer was suggesting, or I would go so far as to say, I'm not averse to taxing all advertising at a low rate. I mean, there's so much of it that is, that is so unproductive, regardless of where it's regardless of where it's appearing, that it's a scourge on our life in a lot of ways. And so, look at just talking like you said, Senator. I mean, this whole we're all depending on the TV shows we watch in our age, we're inundated with advertising for prescription pharmaceuticals. I mean, that's just, in my opinion, advertising that should just not exist. So I don't care if that's being advertised in magazines or on television. If we can impose a 2 or 3% tax on the receipts from providing that kind of advertising, I'm personally all. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and thank you again for inviting me and accommodating my need to be in this.
Thank you for joining us
Thank
today.
you, Mike. Thank you. Any other closing thoughts?
No, just thank you for inviting me to participate, and more than happy to speak at greater length as you go forward. Obviously, this will be a Lobbyist Full Employment Act. You'll be hearing from many people, some of whom you already know, and we'll be happy to offer a perspective. And we have industry experts and legal experts that we can call upon to discuss the more technical aspects.
And my colleague had told me he actually invited quite a few of them.
We did invite. Like I said at the outset, we did invite a bunch of industry folks, especially the more obvious kind of tech stakeholders. They were slated to attend. For various reasons, they could not be here. There were a number of individuals who, when they heard we were holding this event, asked to come in, which we wanted to keep this to a manageable conversation, but we also extended the offer to accept all written feedback and commentary on the topic as well as the 3 bills, and also left the door open to future meetings and future conversations. So let anyone know who is interested in this topic, for, against, neutral, whatever. We are very serious about understanding this world. We want to figure out the best approach here, and we'll want to talk to anyone that wants to talk to us, so that we can figure out what the right and best answer is here.
And I have a very simple approach to tax policy for myself. We need revenue, that's why we have taxes. I'm always happy to hear from the people who would have to pay the taxes, why one model may be less disruptive to them than another. If I just know I need the revenue, I'm not necessarily selective about how we get it from them. They just need to explain to us why this would be a better way to do it, because it would be less of a disruptor in their business model. Like, okay, fine, as long as you're willing to make sure you pay your taxes. I'm perfectly interested in hearing the industry side of the discussion, whatever the tax proposal is.
Yeah.
So.
That's right. Any final thoughts? Mike, do you want to say anything? Or?
Thank you.
All right, great. Jonathan?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We finished 15 minutes early. How about that? Not bad for government work. Really appreciate everyone's participation, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody.